That seems what a lot of our physical theories of everything's are trying to do, is in some sense compute that perfect answer, have that perfect prediction for the future, know exactly what's going on. But then when we look at the natural world around us, and the outcome of quantum physics is such that randomness seems absolutely inherent, right? And it seems something that we really struggle to recreate in computation that we do, but we really need it. We really seem to want it for some things mechanistically. And so what is the role that randomness plays in the computation of, right, of like life? And I think that this is really fascinating because we do have this like balance of order and chaos, and we tend to really, like science, very interested in order, but the world is seemingly very chaotic, and how do we like reconcile these?
Welcome to Demystify Sci, which today should be probably called more like Mystify Sci, because we are sitting down with our friend Michael Hughes to talk about theosophy and anthroposophy through the lens of Rudolph Steiner. So we spend a lot of our time thinking about the really, really objective questions of science and nature and physics and molecules and all of these really real things. And yet we are all possessed by something that runs deeper than just material. It is will, it is spirit, it is randomness, it is the chaos of some internal living system that chooses to do something. Why does it choose to do something? What does it orient towards? And we talked when we were traveling about Ayn Rand's essay to the MIT audience, where she talks about the need to have some kind of larger message. And I think that this conversation fits into that topic pretty neatly. It is something that we are all plagued with. Where do we find meaning? Where do we find purpose? And is science sufficient as a vehicle to present us with meaning and purpose? And this conversation suggests that perhaps it isn't.
And how is science being instrumentalized in our world? And are we being fully conscious of what we're doing when we do science and when we fuel technology? It's obviously a huge fissure in the world right now concerning techno-utopians versus the naturalists. And we don't see that going away anytime soon. And these mythic traditions often speak of similar elements. And so we're going to get into that as well.
And I know we've talked about death on the show before, and people have left in the comments that it was an unexpected portal that we opened. And so towards the end of the conversation, probably in the last 15 or 20 minutes, we do get into the question of death and suicidal ideation. And so if that's something that's a super touchy subject for you, then just keep that in mind.
Otherwise, we want to send a big shout out to our patrons. This project is entirely crowdfunded by people who care enough to shave off a little piece of their paycheck.
Sometimes very big pieces of their paycheck.
Hey, if you had a big paycheck, this small piece could be enormous to us. We eat a lot of peanut butter around here, and we could really use your help keeping the lights on. So come over to patreon.com, check it out. You can join our weekly video chats at that point, which is awesome. We get to hang out with all of our favorite faces and hear, well, what everybody's exploring about the universe, what's exciting, what's going down, what we should be looking into more. And I would love to see you there.
Indeed. Patreon.com/demystifysci. And in the meantime, enjoy our conversation with Michael Hughes. Tell us what you think in the comments, and we will see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I've always been colorblind, so the world was always like invisible of color to me. So I never I think that was always interesting, is that like colorblind people seem to naturally pick up on like tone and texture because color's not reliable. And so I like never went through the world like identifying colors like other people. And it was really nice to date Alexandra, who just like, yeah.
It's always such, it's like the hardest stretch for your imagination to imagine not seeing colors once you've seen them. It's very, I have I wonder so much what that's like.
Do you not see any colors at all? Or is it just red, green?
I have a red-green color weakness, which means that my red cone overlaps with the green. And so I have 3 functioning cones. That's great. And if I have a daughter, because I'll donate 2 functioning like cones, they'll be a super seer, right? Because they'll have now 3 versions of red-green cones, and they all have a different spectra slightly.
That's awesome.
That's pretty cool.
Right? Yeah, for the future.
Get some Super Saiyan ladies out in the world. Next generation. Get to
Yeah,
work.
yeah. See the world a different place.
That's really interesting. Wait, so then will their offspring suffer though?
Suffer is a good word, but no, their offspring, I think if I actually haven't done the math on that. Yeah, like men won't be super seers, but women can be. So I think that they need to pass it like on. I don't know. They have two different sets of X chromosome cells or something. I forget the math on this actually.
Is it a sex? Is color a sex-linked characteristic?
Hangs out on the X chromosome.
These heredity diagrams always gave me anxiety in the
Really?
biology
Me too.
exams. Yeah, I don't know why. It's just
I had to teach genetics once, and it was like I despise the way that genetics like thinks, but it's among the most powerful sciences. But like I think always genetics and structural biology had this huge like one is genetics is really abstract. Like this idea is this weird alchemy that cancels out this other idea, and this is the idea of like gene complementation. But then structure biology, we just want explicit details of physical, like where atoms are and how they're moving, and that tells us what's happening. And so I think that I always grew up in this like it just seems like geneticists and structural biologists have the two opposite ways of approaching like intellectual
like
ideas.
what does it mean to dominate another gene? Like, okay, a gene's an idea, right? It's some code that's expressed in DNA ostensibly. So what does it mean for one code to dominate another code? Like at
It
the
just works
biophysical
better
level?
than it. It will steal things for its reactions. It will elbow the thing
How?
out of the way. Well, everything is based on shape, right? So ultimately,
Yeah.
you have genetic interplay that is manifest in the shapes of the structures that these genes encode.
So they're each producing structures all the time, but one no.
It's if you like zoom out,
Well, it
right?
depends.
Like,
This is I think what Michael's talking about, because if you zoom out, you start to get to gene regulation, and so it could be that
They're
one
silenced?
gene is expressed, and when it's expressed, it activates a network that's output finally downregulates the other gene, which
Must
is the
be
one that
that. It
it's
must be
dominating.
that, yeah.
But sometimes it's just that the protein that it expresses gets in the way of the other one.
right. And so that's like the physical thing, right? That's what I want. And the horror of AlphaFold, coming in and just like solving the protein problem is that it's the geneticist solution, not the structural biologist, right? And so
Say more about that.
they
Also, like, tell people what AlphaFold is.
Yeah, so AlphaFold is, growing up in protein science and structure, it's really, really computationally difficult to see like a string of amino acids that make up your protein sequence, the 20 letters that are the building blocks, and then like from 100 amino acids, predict what shape that looks like. And this
Because
is
it's
so
basically
hard.
a piece of spaghetti that
basically
has
a
to
piece of
fold a
spaghetti.
It's
specific
got sticky parts and repulsive
Yeah.
parts, and
Right.
water
Each
the
letter-
water chemistry matters.
It's all water chemistry at the end, but yeah, no, each building block has its own chemical like personality, right? And how they all talk to each other in that 1 degree line or that situation tells you what kind of a protein you fold or don't fold. Or and the issue is of course that like if we want to predict what your protein shape looks like just from the letters, if you look at every possible combination of like 100 amino acids, having all 20 of them in different combinations, that volume of protein of having one of each of those is more than the volume of the observable universe. Right? And so the space that you have to, what we call chemical space, that you have to like search to see what that 100 amino acid shape folds up into is vast beyond comprehension. So this is the protein folding problem. If you just take that sequence and you want to know what the picture is at the end of the day, this is what AlphaFold actually solved, right? Like it's our best tool at putting in a sequence of amino acids and getting out a structure. And this came out like 2022 or something. And it had always been going to school, always the protein folding problem is the highest thing. But AlphaFold actually works on genetic sequences and multiple sequence alignment. So what AlphaFold is looking at is covariation of like if a frog and a human both have an enzyme, and through evolution, if the enzyme like evolves or it has a mutation in one spot, then there's another mutation that has to counteract it, right? And so through this kind of pairing of ideas, you can kind of see how if it changes in one organism, it's kind of got to change in another, or you can have these pairings And so you can extract a lot of information, enough to fold a protein, from looking at thousands and thousands of sequences and aligning them and machine learning this and putting it in
Is this
a
an openly, freely available software, or is it a proprietary project?
It's quite available. It's a high learning bar, but it's also the future of like protein science, and people are now stretching their legs with this, right? So things that this doesn't do very well, or historically hasn't been trained to do, is proteins are not static machine shapes. They're wiggling dynamic things. And if you change your condition, like the pH or the salt, how does that change your shape? We know it changes it, but now AlphaFold, right? Do you have this kind of information? So the geneticists have like won the protein folding problem. But if you secondly take this and you put it in a different environment, now that what you've machine learned off of is irrelevant. Right? It's not as relevant. It's very different. So there's no physical solution that we have to the protein folding problem. Only a genetic one based on like inference and machine learning.
And so this makes it in some ways a less useful tool, right? Because if you're thinking about being able to take a protein and use its ability to perform some function, like making hydrocarbons or producing insulin or doing anything that you wanted to do in a test tube where you give it the right inputs and the right outputs, but you need to tune the reaction to figure out how to make it work better or work under the conditions that everything else has to be. AlphaFold doesn't give you that because you need structural information about different conditions and functionality. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah. And it's not inherently what's in it. So in a sense, we've like solved the protein problem genetically, but it still lacks this like physical mechanism. We haven't solved it physically, right? With the physical equations where you can like put in your pH and get the protein output there necessarily. And of course, people will figure out how to stretch AlphaFold to the limits, and that's where we're really at now, right? Like, this information is subtly buried somewhere, but yeah, if we can extract it from that is the question. So I still think that there's this like open issue, and this is also the beauty of the water problem, was that I was effectively dealing with the protein folding problem, but the thing I wasn't looking at was how if you solve the protein folding problem, you're effectively figuring out how all those chemical groups in a protein like chaperone, or rather like shepherd the water to different places. So some things like to hoard it, and other things like to get it away. And this is also where I hope that this like water mystery will have a large impact in biochemistry, is that we still don't really understand. If you can understand how the water wants to hang out around a protein, you can really understand how it's going to fold. And if you can understand how water changes with temperature or pH, then you can really understand how the protein will change its fold with temperature and pH. And
I just want to say, if people want to hear more about Michael's water problem,
right,
they should check out the first podcast, which I don't know the number of off the top of my head.
I can look.
Nasty, I'll look it up. But yeah, we had a previous conversation surrounding that.
Right. And that leads us into where we're at today, where I think for the summary from that, right, is that chatted a little bit about my research with water, and or rather with trying to understand neurodegenerative diseases, and how I was looking at protein structures involved in these, and how I couldn't understand how the protein structures were coming about. And that led to, what is the water doing with the protein structure? And while I was kind of going through and deconstructing, how I was thinking about science and going through all this, so the pandemic was happening, and I was trying to be more creative, and where I was searching for solutions and interested in different ideas. And I started to look into the UFO topic and the stories that people shared there, and from a really scientific lens, really mechanistic. Again, a structural biologist like I am are obsessed with mechanism. What is this atom doing, when and why? How does it affect us? And so I was trying to bring this line of thinking to the UFO problem. What is the mechanism that you can do weird physics things, that kind of stuff? And listening to these stories, and the odd turn in me was that through listening to people talk about their experiences, is that I really started to change from mechanism being physically based in reality and atoms, to really opening my mind to different ways that information is transferred. And this, of course, comes in and kind of to give remote viewing, or these more consciousness related topics that are a little bit more out there. We might consider them woo is kind of a term of art, whereas if nuts and bolts is the physical structure of things moving around, then woo is kind of a more esoteric, abstracted, almost genetics, these ideas working with each other. And I started to really, really respect this line of thinking because structure had kind of abandoned me, right? It wasn't turning into a really useful tool. I wasn't getting very far with trying to, because the information that people are giving, they're maybe not trained scientists, all these things. It's not really a data set that I could extract that information from reliably. But what they kept sharing was like personal experiences. And if you kind of like track this down, it put me in the new age where I was listening to new age, like kind of almost like religious figures now, right? Like people trying to see the world a new way. And after like marinating in those stories for a while, I kind of abandoned the concept of truth and was just trying to see what was useful information. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So I'm no longer looking for like the right structural mechanism, just trying to look for something useful. And this is how I came across like what we're alluding to today is like esoteric Christianity and Rudolph Steiner and Gigi Young. And some of these personalities are people who talk about a form of mechanism of the universe of which I was completely, is very abstract and very different from what I was used to. And so now as opposed to like atoms and physicality, it's these general ideas. And I'm curious, what have you guys come up against, like the new age kind of thinking and what your relationship has been with that?
Well, before that, I do want to point out the similarities in the idea of a gene being moved around and genes dominating one another, right? You're talking about an abstraction in action there, right? And it's functional,
That's
right? That's actually like, it's interesting that you're defining almost an engineering outlook on nature as opposed to this raw, physicalist, scientific, pure science view. And I think that when we start talking about this esotericism, it's very much best consumed with that in mind, that it is an abstraction, that we're not necessarily chaining ourselves to physical mechanism anymore. We're actually thinking about the way that different motivational structures play out in reality, the way that civilizations progress, which people have identified patterns in forever and ever and ever. And a lot of this esotericism is born out of mythology or out of mythical traditions, mystery traditions, things like that, where people see these things happening over and over in the world. They see the way things tend towards, and they encode them in this story. So when I was listening to the Steiner lectures that you sent us, I was thinking, man, this is so Blakean. This is
I'm not familiar with that word.
Like William Blake, the poet. He's probably the greatest poet of all time, if you ask me. But he has this way of identifying these trends, and he makes up almost this pantheon of deities to represent them. Like he has this deity called Urizen, which is basically the rational instinct of man that he believes is kind of taking has a sort of dark presence to it. And he's writing, I think, the turn of the 16th century, like a long time ago. Could have been the 17th century, don't hold me to that, but a long time ago. And he's seeing things like industrial war happening for the first time. He's seeing pollution. He's seeing just these trends, and he's comparing it to the deep history of mythology that he's drawing on, not just Christian mythology, but all the way back to as many traditions as he can reach into. And it's very psychedelic, and Blake was a madman, self-professed, and everybody thought he was insane. But centuries later, I think he's Britain's national poet or something like that. Like he's very, very, very well revered, but he was essentially a pauper in his day, and everybody thought he was a madman. And his works do read like the ravings of a madman, but there's something there. There's something there. And that's kind of what I get when I dip my toes into a lot of this esotericism that we're going to be talking about. The first taste is like, this is batshit crazy. And then if you just let yourself sink in it for a second, you start to see that the patterns that they're representing with these mythical entities and so forth actually fit what we see playing out in the world. And that's what I really want to try to cross-reference here. Sorry, you asked a question, though. And I gave a rant.
I think that it was actually a really good answer, because basically the question was, where do you stand on esotericism? And I think that that's a decent answer.
Yeah, and I think that's perfect because like my introduction into taking like this stuff seriously was the ravings of a madman, right? And to me, this was kind of like no one really like shows up with the water story that was going on. I started to read a lot of Gilbert Ling, and the thing about Gilbert Ling is it's like really intense and really, really hard. And Steiner is also really intense and really hard. And it's one of those things where it's really it does come across as the ravings of a madman kind of when reading this stuff, but there was always something there. And I had this profound experience where I read these papers on water structure and how its role in biology by a Dr. Philippa Wiggins, the late Philippa Wiggins from New Zealand. And the first time I read her paper, I was like, this is absurd or insane. And then put down, and 2 months later, I was like, this person is inspired and profound, right? It just really took me to really confront and to sit and marinate on the ideas that they had to now retake this seriously. And of course, the words that she wrote never changed, right? The only thing that changed was my perspective of how I valued the ideas that she was saying. And it was because of what I was experiencing. I started to like read the same things that she was, right? I started to go through the same journey. And it turns out there's kind of like a reliable outcome of that journey, right?
Well, it's interesting because you can also look at a conventional science paper, especially a biological one. Shiloh is saying that genes feel like an abstraction, and
Yes.
they're not. I can see what you mean by that, but on some level, the gene represents some nucleic acid sequence that is then made.
I mean, you can forget about biology and go with forces and fields and other abstractions.
But I think that this is relevant here, which is that you read a genetics paper and it also feels like the ravings of a madman.
Yeah.
There's just like if you enter into it as an uninitiated reader and you pick it up the same way that you do for the first time a book of poetry or Steiner or anything else, you're uninitiated, never seen it before you start to read it, it is not English. There's all these acronyms that are dancing around, that are doing these things. The words are esoteric. The things that they're discussing are invisible. They appear to be saying things about the interior quality of life that appear almost impossible or impenetrable or whatever. And so I don't think that it is massively different. And this touches on something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is that what is the difference between science and myth, between story and fact? And I haven't settled on a bottom line for that, but I feel like this ties into the esotericism conversation because, well, we're just telling stories. Science is a type of story. Esotericism is a type of story. And they all...
the Neil deGrasse Tyson in me would be like, I can't believe he lives in me somewhere, but he would be like, it's about there being testable predictions of your story.
Right. So we say like how coherent your story is, right? Like how self-referentially, or how would you talk about that then? Because I think it's really important.
Well, I think that a moral story, the Aesop's fables. I grew up on Aesop's fables, and so for me, that's the easiest example to point to. You have the fox that wants to get the grapes, but it doesn't get the grapes, and it walks away, and it's like, the grapes are sour anyways. That never happened. As far as I know, foxes don't eat grapes. But
I mean, frankly, the difference is it's not meant to be taken literally. It's actually better the less literal you take it.
It's not meant to be taken literally, but it does seek to communicate a truth that is in some way predictable. Right? You're making a prediction about the future because you will be in a situation like that at some point. That's the prediction. And the prediction is also that this is, if you act this way, it will cause you some kind of moral damage.
Yes. And again, this is that kind of like experience, right? When I was reading, a genetics paper made no sense at first, or this water paper makes no sense at first, and then it's kind of this experience then like ends up justifying. And it's interesting how these stories kind of try and like seemingly organize these thoughts and ideas for us about these abstract subjects. And I think that the not taking literal versus taking literal is really, really curious to me, because my first endeavor into an interest in religious texts was actually a really literal interpretation. This is effectively what Ancient Aliens is, right? This kind of like New Age idea is that when we study these texts, we're going to bring our really scientific, rigorous mind. We're going to try and like decipher these metaphors that these people used long ago and try and be like, what were they really meaning? And I think that the assumption is that they were trying to describe something of physically a reality that like they didn't understand. But then the turn is that from like a more esoteric point, the metaphor was very much on purpose because it should not be taken literally, right? And this is kind of the opposite school of like esoteric Christianity, is not taking this literally at all. There is a more like mythological version of these ideas that we should be paying attention to. And in fact, there's this concept called profaning the mystery that I think is important. And that's ultimately like, as someone who's an enthusiast about this, what I'm going to do, but there are these central mysteries that these people are trying to pass down and understand. And that when you try and like interpret them incorrectly, perhaps using a really literal lens, there's a certain profaning that happens. You twist the morals that you get from these stories. Right? And so I think that this is really interesting because I never realized until Shiloh said when we were hanging out, but a cosmology is kind of an origin story that we have, right? And so we all have these different cosmologies and origin stories and how they play together. And I was kind of trying to go in and like our cosmology is based on science where we can check, do this hypothesis testing that Neil deGrasse Tyson might send us. And so then that's what I was trying to do with these other stories. But then how do you do this like checking of ideas with something that's meant to be far less literal, right? And far more esoteric or rather ethereal. And that became a really interesting like version, place for my mind to spend because how was my science useful there, right? I know it seems really hard to draw something concrete. And I think this gets at what you're getting at is like, what is the just question, what is the purpose of science, of Aesop's fables? What are they trying to tell us? What is information? And the realization is that our current scientific cosmology is kind of like devoid of meaning, right? It's like a seemingly kind of like a random happenstance that's interesting. You can find beauty in this randomness. You can find beauty that was just some random events billions of years ago, and then voila, we were like born. The beauty is not lost on me. But it doesn't give much direction, right? If you inherit this as your origin story, what does it tell you to do in the future?
It's also a lot of hopelessness, right? The heat death of the universe, or black holes swallows the galaxy, or the
Newtonian physics, like being fate, right? I think that we've gone through this like really series of evolution of thought of that's exactly it, right? Like if we play this clock forward based on our observations now, then we have this fate that's really like we're just gonna slowly simmer off into oblivion over several trillion years with heat death, right?
Prescribed destiny, almost.
Exactly. And, I think it's kind of interesting, like, did this prescription of destiny exist before Newton, right? Like, you come up with these ideas, you really rigorize calculus and physics, and now you can suddenly, like, predict with incredible accuracy events around you in the world, right? And I'm not sure if we had this before. And so now we get obsessed with this predicting this like clockwork of the universe. And we get so good at doing this and we get so good at measuring our predictions that we eventually get to, the dawn of quantum, where now we're measuring so well that our measurements no longer make sense. And suddenly this whole clockwork notion of God's plan of the universe and your fate gets like thrown into question in our human thinking, where now things seem truly random. That is what quantum physics kind of tells us, or like not truly random, because you can still like deviate from this randomness. And I think that this 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics is really, that's a story that's like 60 years in the making of just looking, and I don't know too much about this, and if you guys feel like anything about this, I think it's curious, but how and like what information is and how it's transmitted, right, is far different than what Newtonian physics expected. So once again, we're now at this like change in cosmic thought of humanity that really is opening the door to not having this like clockwork universe, or maybe it looks different than what the Newtonian physics gave us. And I think that we're really in this era where we got so good at measuring that we measured to like absurdity, right? Our ruler got so small that we no longer make sense of what we're measuring. And this is like, you can't predict where a particle will go once you know its location, like kind of particle wave duality, according to our cosmology. And I think that that's where we sit right now in this like midst of changing of human thought through these different like scientific paradigms, right? And yeah, that's kind of where I got stuck for a long time. And it was in this like search for meaning, right, that I think that a lot of people start to to dive deep in for me was looking into these different podcast theories of everything, trying to figure out what people are thinking on this. And I think that this is also like where the actually, I'm a little bit stuck right now on this one. Maybe you guys can help me out.
Wait, wrap it onto a point that can be not to, that sounds mean. Wrap it to something that has a catch on it, because that was a lot of ideas.
Right. My favorite place I'd like to like get to with that, or there's two. One is
well, the question,
different versions.
I mean, there's so many things there. The fact that we've come down to the limits of our measurements, and then that we don't sort of recognize that that's what's happening, is really interesting. So I think it is interesting what you're saying, that scientists themselves, physicalists, scientists, physicists, have come to the point where they're faced with things that don't make sense, and they're open to telling all sorts of mystical stories about what's happening down there for the first time in several hundred years, where that became possible again, because we're in the dark with those things. And the same can be said about deep cosmology and astrophysics. You can't really see that well what's happening super far away or in the distant past. The same thing happens with archaeology and so forth. You reach these points where you're at the limits of your observation. Now, you might be able to do experiments, and then they're indirect assays. So you have to, again, you get to kind of have this Ouija board where you can fill in the blanks a bit. But even science in the Western world itself has come up against this nebulous region where myth-making can occur. The question is the modern scientific myth-making meaningful? And I would argue that it's not.
And this is something that I think is really important, because at some point, when you get far enough down to a theory, you get to choose how you explain the thing that you're seeing. And and you get to choose on the basis of your most deeply held quiet beliefs that drive you on a day-to-day level.
Right.
And so if you look at the distinction between, Bohr and Einstein, who famously were on opposite sides of the interpretation of quantum physics. Einstein's God doesn't play dice, Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation. This is the epitome of these two metaphysical systems that come into conflict with one another. And at the time, Einstein is getting old. He's no longer the prince of the physics world. He's now this befuddled king that's paraded out like a figurehead at these conferences and at these parties, and they carry him on the palanquin as something to worship, but they're not necessarily listening to what he's saying, because he's sitting on the palanquin and he's saying that, no, this, what you're saying isn't right, it's not possible. There are reasons that you can turn away from this probabilistic, irrational mess. And Bohr, on the other hand, is very powerful at the time. And he's the one who's insisting that the probabilistic interpretation is the necessary one. And this is a metaphysical conflict, because both interpretations are valid. And it is the zeitgeist of the times that chooses which one becomes more popular.
Right. And that's so powerful, right? Like, I think this is what is very important. And in previous podcasts where you guys were on the road, you talked about this of like, we enter in as scientists with a set of ideas, and this biases us. We enter in with a cosmology. And so kind of describing that Bohr and Einstein have completely different cosmologies looking at the same data. Right, one where there's a world of randomness and one where there's a world of God not playing dice, which seems to implicate a strict order. And I think the data supports both, and I really like this idea of quantum physics is like a pile of observations with no real like agreed upon theory, right? And I think that you guys have come across this now, and I think this is also, after trying to follow different theories of everything for a long time, the question kind of stopped becoming relevant to me, because I didn't realize like what I would do with that, right? It becomes one of those things where the heat depth of the universe is in like several billion years. I to understand that completely now at this point in my life seems to like be a little bit delusional. right? And so what are the questions that we should be, not delusional, I can't like place me, but if that's the case, like what should I be doing now? And this is also where I actually really like the concept of astrology in kind of the New Age. And I think that I grew up to kind of not take it very seriously as a scientist, but also a little bit of resentment, kind of resenting this idea of fate, right? Like I don't want the world to tell me what to do. I want to make it. I don't want to be at the whim of what's happening. But astrology is a very, very old science. Looking at studying the cosmos is kind of oftentimes how we connect historically with our past selves, right? They're recording of these astrological things, and this was their science at the time, taken so seriously that it seems like the mechanism found in the bottom of the Mediterranean, that was like a Greek mechanical computer that seemed to be important for predicting motions of the stars, right? Like high technology at the time went into astrology. It may have been their key thing. And so as opposed to like the Greeks were talking about fighting fate, but there's another interpretation of astrology is knowing how to surrender to the time that is, right? Knowing where you are in place and time. And so as opposed to trying to fight and construct your world, you're trying to understand what you do where you're at in time. And it's kind of a slight shift of cosmology.
And yet, evolution is driven by individuals making the choice of what the future will look like relative to what the present is. I don't think that that's the concept, that's the normal way that natural selection is talked about. What are you going to say?
Oh, no, sorry, I can't relate that to natural selection. I was going to say, like, you mentioned before you get too far past it, what's the point of really trying to understand these deep cosmological issues or the quantum level issues, because they don't really affect our lives in the foreseeable future. And I think the only reason to care, or at least the only one I've found, is that there is an actual war between chaos and order at all times, everywhere, with every single interaction that you undergo. And I really believe in the side of order. And so when somebody tries to tell me that something doesn't have to make sense, I see them as on the other side of that battle. And so maybe that's not a healthy way of looking at it, but that's how I look at it. I don't think that it's an instrumentalizable thing in the ordinary sense of being able to build a technology better because we understand the fate of the universe or the eternity of the universe or whatever it is. But I think believing that there is a way to understand it in any conceivable detail or fashion, that it can be understood, that reality can be understood, that nature can be understood, allows you to then act in the most appropriate way, which is good.
Okay, so I think that you have to have both chaos and order. And
well, chaos is the default, yeah.
Chaos is the default, and so you can imagine a world that becomes ordered so completely that it just never changes again. That's what ultimate order is. It is that we will always and forever continue to do things in this exact way that we have ordered them into being, and we have conquered all chaos, and so there's no
there's
more
parasitic order, right? This is the whole replicator versus team consciousness. Look, order in and of itself is not. It's not really an end. The idea is just that that something can be understood as a form of it. That's what I mean by order in this case.
Sure. I think that it's really important to realize, or for me to see it as being the goal is to take chaos and to order it. Like that is what life does.
Yeah.
That is the point of life.
While creating hella chaos.
Later, though. Externalized chaos. The chaos will happen once the body decays fully. There's a moment of...
Have you heard of this guy, Rod Swenson, before? I would check out his website.
Okay,
Swenson or Swenson, yeah. He has this theory. He does this mathematical derivation of the laws of thermodynamics and basically tries to argue that life can be defined as that which maximizes entropy, right? So it doesn't disobey the second law, as maybe you learned in high school, but it actually maximizes entropy just outside of itself. So it tears up everything better than any other chemical reaction could possibly do it, which is an interesting take.
And I think this like chaos versus order thing is really important, kind of like what we're talking about, or like these central themes of having both and playing together. And how it presents to me is like what's something that your computer can't do? And a reasonable answer might be chaos in the sense of making random numbers. Right. What is an algorithm to make random numbers? If you come up, there's all sorts of mathematical ways where we're trying to get computers to make random numbers, but they're never really actually random, right? You have to sample some outside phenomenon for random. right? And so
Cloudflare famously has a display inside of its offices of lava lamps, and based off of where the lava is in the lamp, they have a camera that takes a picture and uses that as a random function or a random generator in one of their functions for, I think, security or encryption or something like that.
yeah, any of it. And this is like very fascinating to me. And these are ideas that are explored by a book called Ways of Being by James Bridle. And I think that this was really interesting to me because the author, they really like dive into this subset of ideas where, what are the consequences of doing computation in a computer that we have, where it's a perfect outcome like every time, right? And that's what we want. And in fact, that seems what a lot of our physical theories of everything's are trying to do, is in some sense compute that perfect answer, have that perfect prediction for the future, know exactly what's going on. But then when we look at the natural world around us and the outcome of quantum physics is such that randomness seems absolutely inherent, right? And it seems something that we really struggle to recreate in computation that we do, but we really need it. We really seem to want it for some things mechanistically. And so what is the role that randomness plays in the computation of, right, of like life? And I think that this is really fascinating because we do have this like balance of order and chaos, and we tend to really like science, very interested in order, but the world is seemingly very chaotic, and how do we like reconcile these? And I think that this is like fascinating when viewed through the lens of information dynamics. And where this kind of comes up on is this idea of the second law of information thermodynamics. And I don't know tons about this, but it's based on the concept that, as you're alluding to, is that in the world around us, the natural world, that entropy is always increasing, meaning disorder is always increasing, which means that things are slowly falling apart around us. But then, according to Rod Swenson, is this idea that the living being maximizes entropy outside of itself and that pays the cost to minimize entropy within yourself. So minimizing entropy within yourself means ordering your body, right? But now when we're talking less about particles and we're talking more about abstract concepts like information theory and transfer, this concept of the second law of information thermodynamics is that you can have a physical system where it gets more chaotic and more like higher entropy over time, but you actually refine ideas through time. And you can make more ordered ideas. And how people might look at this or play this out is that we got to watch COVID-19's genetics change as it happened in real time, and we've never sequenced something so much. And so you can change so many parts about this virus, and it'll slightly change how it interacts with the human body. But there are certain parts of these enzymes that you can't change. It's almost like this platonic ideal of an enzyme that will exist as long as this organism is going to be with you, or that our bodies are in some sense refining the idea of what a living human is. Right? There's certain ideas that these information that you have to keep with you through time, or otherwise you just do not procreate, right? You don't pass that idea on. So evolution is, in a sense, is turning the physical world into chaos, but it's refining these abstract ideas. And these ideas might be literally like an enzyme function that we can measure or something like that. And so that's something that never gets lost through this evolution. And I think that then this is a bit of a jumping off point, and we can maybe like talk around or others, but as I was delving into these theories of everything, I came across this character called Tom Campbell. And Tom Campbell is really interesting. He's got a book called My Big Toe, and he's someone who has the equivalent. He never actually defended his PhD, so he does not have a PhD, but he did like 6 years of PhD work in the 60s in physics. And this is why I quite liked him, right? He approaches this world with a very physical lens, and he speaks the language that I speak as a scientist. But his twist or his bend is that when he was younger and in college, he started to do meditation. And so he's really started to have these, seemingly more religious or Eastern philosophy type ideas integrated into his way of thinking while he was going through his schooling. And so he would actually say things like he would practice meditating on the problems that he was doing, and he would have punch cards for programs. And so he would meditate on them, like, where's the error? And so you could highlight where an error was because it was really hard to check your programming on punch cards. And he would also find errors like not just in the lines of coding, but in how his deck was organized, or something that was not, it was just like almost a clerical error. And he would get really valuable information from meditating. And so he puts down his My Big Toe, his theory of everything, that has to include not only how the physical universe operates, but also how we have psychic abilities, how we have all these other things that we're using, and how he integrates that into our world. And he claims that our experience here is that we're in a like consciousness trainer to hone the idea of like love, to learn how to love, or to learn how to organize ourselves. And why this comes in is it's kind of, again, it looks like this idea of the point of life is that you're actually refining the information in your soul. If you're to take this abstraction, right? There's some part of you that lives on. And so the cost of the physical world degrading around you is to refine the concepts of this like eternal body of the soul that passes on. And so when people are talking about reincarnation and trying to do these things, this is what Tom Campbell is he has to say, I have to integrate this idea of reincarnation into my big theory of everything, or otherwise it can't adequately explain anything. So why do you have reincarnation? Why do you have these odd, like old religious teachings? And it seems to revolve around this idea of refining the soul in some way, which now plays nicely into these, laws of thermodynamics that we're coming across if you look at it like abstractly enough. Right?
I mean, you'd probably see that in every single religious or metaphysical tradition that you looked for, right? This philosopher's stone, right? Trying to turn lead into gold, trying to become like even the Christ-like aspirations of the Christians to turn the other cheek. You see this everywhere. It does seem to be the Buddhist tradition, right? You could ascend to nirvana and you don't have to come back and do it all over again, right? If you get it right, if you nail your karmic balance.
Yeah.
So, one thing that with the Buddhism and if you nail it right, you never have to come back. It's also that if you get it right, maybe you never go away in the first place. Like, I'd never really thought about that. Like because you're saying something about order and randomness, and it seems like the goal of life is to create order out of randomness.
It seems to be we have now physical laws that seem to allow this to happen. So entropy, you're not always just breaking the universe down, you're maybe refining information while you're doing this.
So
right? And then this looks like, again, an interesting tidbit where, all these mythologies that we have seem to talk about this too.
Exactly. Yeah. And so as long as you have order, you also have perfect function. And in some ways, I think that order might be linked to immortality, even in the biological sense, because if you have a body that starts to break down and the cells within it progressively become more chaotic, you die. That's what our best models of aging right now are. It's just that when you're young, all of your liver cells do liver cell things, and when you're old, some of them just don't. They're just broken.
Right.
And so if you can achieve ultimate order, what you have done is you have also achieved in the same breath immortality. And immortality also seems to be a way of getting out of this reincarnation, eternal recurrence cycle. Because if you never leave, you never do it again.
And you see it I forgot to bring up the UFO community or this idea. These alien abductions often concern this idea that we should be taking better care of the planets, and we have to learn how to ultimately, for lack of a better word, love one another better, right? And even so, as we start to pick into the Steiner a bit, and you get into this, you also saw this. I don't know if you guys listened to the last week's podcast with Ogi and Andres, we were talking about these entities that people experience in altered states of consciousness, through DMT, through different religious experiences. You also get this conserved message and this view that perhaps the local cosmos, the galaxy itself, is structured and teeming with intelligent entities that are all playing out some tier of the same dramas that are playing out here on Earth, and that we must in some way ascend to their level. And there's this mythos about training the human, like you said, to refine the soul, to be worthy of that conversation. But you can look at it from any tradition you want, whatever your ethnic, cultural background is. There's this story is there.
And it is a metaphysical one. This is what people often use metaphysics to be everything that physics is not.
And so metaphysics being what would be your definition of metaphysics?
The set of rules that allow you to tell a story. right? There's a metaphysics of
fascinating.
sci-fi, which is that the tools that you use for telling that story is technology. There's a technology that is based in science that can do something, and we haven't achieved it yet, but this is all plausible. Carl Sagan's Contact is a great example of this, because he doesn't just say that Jodie Foster's character travels through dimensions. He comes up with a plausible mathematical theory, the wormhole, with the assistance of Kip Thorne, that says that you can bend the space-time continuum in such a way where you get from one place to another very, very quickly. Okay, fine. So this is sci-fi. Fantasy has a different metaphysics. No technology, magic, spirit, wands, wizards, orcs, enchantment.
Right.
Science has a metaphysics of objectivity, which is that you are an eyeball that looks upon the earth, that sees things. Religion has the metaphysics of supernaturalism, which is that the cause for things is God. And so cause, like ultimate cause for everything that happens in your story, I think that that's metaphysics.
I like this. I like this a lot. And I think this was also really curious to me because I kind of got into like the UFO abduction stories and trying to understand. To me, what was really curious was like the metaphysics of what they say like an alien being is that Shia was alluding to with these different characters. Like, what do they hold value dear? And I remember like a few personal things. Like I remember listening to stories and I would hear, this person recount that they were asked about their relationship with God by an alien entity, and I was like, I thought that was like very odd as a scientist. I just thought I had this assumption that we're like slowly edging God out of the equation, that any like Star Trek type of being is also going to be further along on that path. And it was very odd, like the kinds of questions that they had, because what this alludes to is that if these beings are there, that they have a cosmology that's like very different than what I had imagined the natural cosmology to like be in the future from me. And I kind of got obsessed with learning these different cosmologies. And this kind of comes on the back of like interacting with these big theories of everything and what they hold value. And how I would like go about interacting with this is talk to people that would like say that they channel aliens or channel different entities through them. And this was really curious because at this point in my life, I think that it's reasonable that you can get information about the world through these methods, whether it's like channeling, remote viewing. There's so many stories, our government, the CIA, using these techniques to get some kind of actionable information. So at this point in my life, looking into it, I'm open to the idea of channeling and some kind of being through you, or having a DMT trip and having an experience like this as giving you actionable information. And people have tried to do things like archaeology or different kinds of studies on this, like actual scientific studies based upon this information, to different results that are really interesting to learn about. So at this point,
it pops open the huge question of where ideas come from in the first place, right? That's
a question.
That's an impossible question to answer. And you can point to associations with previous experience and knowledge bases and so forth, but the novel gluing together of those seems to just fall in your lap when it happens. And that's a really profound and spooky experience to have happen. I'm sure we've all had it happen on various levels.
I think so too. I think it's like also of the time and age where we're starting to like have these intense experiences and breaking down what we think we know to hold true. And I to get like really interested in these different aliens that people would channel. And like one particular is like Bashar by Daryl Anka, and he's got this really
my friend Doug's way into Bashar.
Oh yeah,
remember?
Bashar.
I think they bought a ticket to go see him and stuff. Yeah, and shout out to him.
I think like Bashar is the saying is like there's like.
Can we tell people who Bashar is?
Introductions.
Yeah, we should definitely. So
I don't know enough about this.
Is a person that says that they can channel this entity Bashar through them, and so Daryl Anka will go to like a room and then sit there and like meditate or get himself into a mind state, and then you'll hear him start speaking in a different intonation, and he says that he is channeling Bashar and that Bashar is speaking through him to the people, and so they'll have the audience like ask questions, and then the answer will be ostensibly from the entity Bashar communicating through Daryl Anka to the audience. And I
believe he's also channeled all the like several volumes of sacred text through this entity and so forth too. I might be confusing that with somebody else, but there's something to that.
So Yeah, there's something there. I actually have come across a different the Seth material. I think there's a woman who was a writer in the 60s who would go into state, and sensibly a being wrote a book through her of channeling.
But this is pretty common. There's a lot of these folks, it seems like.
There's quite common. And so I would listen to a few of these, and you get kind of an sense of the cosmology of these different like beings, right? And a common one, like maybe Bashar in particular, is that he claims to be a human hybrid from the future, and that what we're dealing with now is them interacting with and doing this kind of like genetic manipulation to hybridize them because they were
classic alien grayling story.
Classic alien, right? They had destroyed their own world, and so they're trying to like reintegrate and rebuild and do it right, and that they need humans' help for this, and they have to like work through us, and that there will be human alien hybrid children with us in the future. And this is something that's commonly talked about in like Dolores Cannon's material, Dolores Cannon as well, who's quite well known for hypnotic regressions, hypnotizing people to a place, and then you ask that person, what does that entity, like what does Michael need to do to overcome his issue with like dreams or work or whatever I'm up against? And so then in this hypnotized state, I would like answer for myself, like, what does Michael need to do? And get a lot of like information from like channeled beings here. And so these channeled beings seem to have this kind of cosmology about them. And this seems to be where, you're, to sum up like lightly, like you genetically splice different things into you, and that's how you experience different things, like different versions of the story. And a different way of like moving through the world and different alchemy. And you kind of think of this now makes me like think of when I was interacting with the US government releasing like the 2017 New York Times article on UFO sightings and these tapes that they've released, the Tic Tac videos, these kinds of things. There's this story that comes up that the Navy is out here releasing this, and they say that these are real, that these are sensors capture this, and we should talk about this. And that we have hearings now in the Senate, and that there's different armed forces. And so the mythology is that the Navy wants to talk about this, and that people like Lou Elizondo have said that people in the Air Force do not want to talk about this, and that they actually think that there's demonic entities that are behind this. So Michael listening to Bashar in early 2000s or 2020 is kind of thinking that this makes sense. Like the Navy group is actually like trying to tackle this, whereas the Air Force group I don't trust because they're just like ascribing to like religious ideas. And so kind of builds this tension in the government where we have one group seemingly trying to tackle and the other like surrendering to this religious ideal and not wanting to touch it. And so I have like my feelings about that. And so how this like plays forward then is where all of this comes to is then I'm on a Reddit page, and I get exposed to a thread on esoteric Christianity through Gigi Young, and was referencing Gigi Young's Esoteric Keys to Disclosure. And Gigi Young is a self-proclaimed mystic and psychic who has an interesting story. So, and she presented a completely different cosmology from these like gray beings coming back to interact with humanity to try and create alien human hybrids to perpetuate their civilization. Her cosmology is very different, and it ones where it relies on that the humans are these godly beings, and that humanity is kind of on this journey on learning how to become angels and archangels. And so all of what we're seeing today is actually a manifestation,
which is very classic, by the way. That's a much more classic take, right? That's very Blakean, I would say.
Timeless, right? Like this has been with humanity for so long, and it's kind of like this new idea of these aliens coming out of nowhere is a really modern, very shallow history.
It seems to reflect some deep paranoia about these men in white coats and these procedures and the technology being beyond comprehension and physics not making sense. Like it reflects that sort of chaotic paranoia to me.
I can't agree more. And I think, again, what like Anastasia was saying earlier, how this genetics paper is just like not a language that humans speak unless you're a geneticist, right? It's really hard to engage with the people who are like doing that and living their life through that cosmology. So no wonder, right, there would be groups of people who that cosmology doesn't seem to work for. They can't interact with it, right? It is really tricky and really hard. And so this cosmology that Gigi Young describes is a far different one, where evolution does exist, and what we're doing is an evolution of consciousness, not an evolution of like the body's form necessarily, right? And so this evolution of conscious thought is how humans, as we perceive ourselves, started, and how we will progress into the future. And part of this evolution of conscious thought is that you're introduced to aspects of yourself from different dimensions or different times or different places. And so when these entities visited us, it's a aspect of humanity visiting humanity along our path to evolution. And there's a lot more to unpack about the cosmology of esoteric Christianity, because I think it's one of those things where I start to say this and it sounds insane, but there's a strong rigor around the rules that they use to organize their cosmology. And I found that to be really fascinating, how deep this was. Because I tend to think of like a language or order, metaphysics, and how I judge it is how self-referential it holds, right? How easy can you like break that frame of thought? And so in science and materialism, you have some like assumptions, but as soon as you get down to like our understanding of quantum stuff, it really just changes. The ideas that you bring in are what you get out, right? The different interpretation of quantum mechanics that you have tells you your cosmology. And so we're all like agreeing on the things that we're looking at, but we have completely different understandings of what this means. And so, and that this is actually like a natural aspect of human evolution, to have different aspects of humanities from different times and dimensions come interact to reflect back at humanity what you are, so that you can then choose what you want to become. And
it might be cool to just take a specific example and tear it apart a little bit, because we can take the most recent one you sent us, for example, with the creepy spider beings that are coming down and the Vulcans. I mean, it sounds absolutely bananas on the surface, but we don't have to use that example, but maybe some particular story from this tradition and see what's going on with it.
Right. So one particular story that Steiner uses in this is how, and kind of comparing a scientific thought to his theory of thought, is he describes like trying to study how horse and buggy carriage like will navigate through a city. And so you look at how it's interacting, this horse and carriage interacts with the city, the roads, the people, and seems to make its decisions and go through. And you can come up with a great natural science from this. But if you neglect to wonder what the driver inside the buggy is doing, that there is some human being like steering that buggy, then it'll be really, really hard to make sense of the actions of this horse and carriage. Right? And so our natural sciences, in this case, he's saying it by his metaphor, is the study of where this thing is going. But then the spiritual science is the recognition that there's like a driver in there. You're trying to understand like how the driver is impacting where this is going. Right. And so based on this, then it comes into play of, well, the driver is a conscious being who's making decisions, right? And so where does this conscious being come from? And this is the cosmology of the esoteric Christianity, is this grand overarching view of how the human evolves to where we're at, and how we like have a future evolution. And the future evolution will get to these like strange spider beings, right? But the thoughts on evolution are that the human consciousness has to evolve in steps, and that we do this by there's an angelic hierarchy of beings, and there's a rigorous hierarchy of like 10 beings that we are, and we're on that hierarchy, and we're trying to like progress through it. And I, first of all, don't have like a great reaction to this, because I don't like the concept of hierarchies. And I think a lot of what we're doing these days is trying to like tear down hierarchies. But the central tenet of this is kind of like understanding where you are in the order of the hierarchy. But we'll get back to that later. And so
it's like an internal progression, though. It's not necessarily stacking up against others so much as against your own potential. As far as that's my most generous take on it, anyways.
I think,
which is very, by the way, that's very much how my life goes every day too. Like I'm either living up to what I could be, or I'm not, and I'm usually not. But that's I
don't think that's true.
Well, I'm just saying, on whether it's the tiniest little things, it's you're always on this hierarchy with yourself. That's all I'm trying to point out.
Absolutely. And and how much personal responsibility you take for your own actions. Right? Some people's cosmology places that outside, and I think that's what a lot of people dislike about the New Age, is it's like this moon's doing something, so I'm not this, or these alien beings are screwing with our government, so I don't have to do something, right? And
that's the
yeah.
hand grenade of literalism that just ruins all these discussions. As far as go ahead.
Not just that. No, but not just that. It is the hand grenade of literalism, but it is also comes back to what you're saying about life ordering chaos. It's like the thing that the moon wants you to do is the chaos. It is your job to resist that, and in resisting it, create something stable, as opposed to allowing yourself to be pulled down into the undertow.
I can't agree more. I'd replace one word of as opposed to resist to use the word integrate. And that resist implies this like fight, right? You're not going to fight the moon, but you can like live with it in a sense. Or you could fight the moon. It's a very reasonable thing.
I mean, let's say it's Mars or the raid. Like that might be easier. There's probably times you should resist the moon or resist Mars or something like that. But I think integrating it is understanding that it's part of you and that you don't have to give into it at all times.
And so this is a big part, is that the cosmos in this theory is a reflection of the inner self, right? And so everything outside is a reflection of what's inside. And so if you get in this habit of trying to fight or resist, then you want to excise yourself, right? And this is going to destroy or mutilate yourself. Whereas if you integrate, you get to like make this order with yourself, right? Or fix your relationship with yourself.
Like integration implies a kind of balance that resist doesn't, right? Because the moon belongs in you, Mars belongs in you. And if you try to resist those things for too long, then what happens is that you, like you said, you excise parts of yourself. And so you can never really quite be calm or functional, because there's these huge battles waging inside of you all the time, as opposed to being integrated and balanced. And it's like, okay, well, this lives here, and this is the healthy expression for it, right? Like if you have an anger problem,
that's right,
maybe you should take up kickboxing.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's the place where it belongs. Or you should be a lumberjack. Or there's any number of things where you can use that and channel it and give it a home.
Please don't become a police officer.
Exactly. Like
and this is like central to this cosmology of how we learn to like be a person, right? And what's the goal of this? And I think that central to this is, again, everything outside of us is a reflection of what's inside. And so we're just trying to understand this, and it's all like useful metaphors for rearranging yourself inside. And that there's a certain progression or evolution to this. And so Rudolph Steiner actually...
And that's what gives it the predictive power, right?
Yeah, this is like hypothesis testing, or this is where it becomes a spiritual science, right? Is that if I can tell a story and I can reliably help you like get an answer that you care about, then maybe it's a useful story. But if I can't, then don't worry about it, right? This isn't for you, or it's not. You can have your own thoughts. But I think that this is what I mean by like self-referential, right? This is what I find fascinating about stories, is not judging the truth as much as the utility and how cohesive it is. And part of this Christian esoterica, this cosmology that Rudolph Steiner describes, are these different planetary bodies are reflections of aspects within ourselves. And so, of course, the orbits of the heavens in some way are a reflection of what's going on inside of us, and that we're here to learn these lessons, and that there's an evolution to humanity. And he splits this off into different epochs, where there's a Saturn evolution, a Sun evolution, a Moon evolution, an Earth evolution, which is where we're at, a Jupiter evolution, a Venus evolution, and then a Vulcan evolution, a Vulcan. And so these are 7 planets. And then within each of those evolutions, there's going to be its own 7 major epochs. And then in each of those 7 major epochs, there'll be 7 minor epochs. And so just to place us where we are on this journey, we're at the Earth evolution in the middle, which happens in his cosmology to be the most material, right? The most solid and dense, whereas the ones before us and the ones after are more ethereal. So there's not as much in the physical as there is. And how the Earth major epochs go are the Polarian epoch, the Hyperborean, the Lemurian epoch, the Atlantean epoch, the post-Atlantean epoch, which is where we're at now, and then the 6th epoch and the 7th epoch. And each of these epochs has a different thing that evolution wants to like cross off the box for human evolution. So we're learning something different at each one of those. So according to Steiner, I believe in like So I believe that the Polarian is Earth has to split from the sun, and so the Hyperborean is that the moon has to split from the Earth. And again, our like strongest theories of the moon are like a strong impact coming out. So the moon splits from the Earth in the Hyperborean. Then during the Lemurian period, humanity starts to ascend on to Earth, and we take a form that's very different from what we have today. It's Steiner describes this as like a jelly-like being, and we also have a different conscious experience of what it is.
Sounds like majority of Americans, I suppose.
Yeah, right. We can. We're always repeating the same cycles, and part of this is that you're not physically like indwelled. Your experience of being human is more of a hive mind and more removed, where you're kind of like shuffling a Sims character around, maybe, as opposed to being the first person character. Right. And so then
that sounds familiar too.
Exactly. Right. I live in my phone. Yeah. And so with this comes, first of all, the evolution of the human body. Right. So the human body has a different form and also feels different to the conscious at the time. So in evolution, you also have to evolve your form to allow for your body to indwell. So during the evolution of Lemuria to the Atlantean period is all about trying to like learn how to integrate into the physical world. And so you're like materializing, you're going from dematerialized etherically and trying to learn how to be on the planet. And that you have to evolve the right organs, meaning literally parts of your brain, right? Like you might start with the pineal gland, which can sense light, and then you might evolve to where you have that's now internalized and you have color vision. Now you can like integrate with the world differently. And this is really important because your sensory perception is your reality, right? Like I can't really prove anything exists outside my head, but I can get like these sensory inputs, and that's what I go on. So this evolution of form is going to inherently change your conscious experience because you're changing the inputs into your conscious experience. And that each of these different epochs has major parts of lessons that we're supposed to learn spiritually that have these spiritual meanings. And so like the moon splitting from Earth might be that of polarity, right? New Age and everyone describes us as living in a very polar period. And this shows up in our physics. We have a negative and a positive side, and this creates a spectrum between, right? And so this idea of polarity was really, really important. And then after we have like gotten these important aspects and made them part of ourselves, learn the lessons we need to make space for the new lesson, there's kind of a catastrophe. There's like a wiping of the slate. And this is, Shiva, I become destroyer of worlds, like Oppenheimer's thing. Oppenheimer was very, very educated on this. But if you just leave that Shiva, destroyer of worlds, it doesn't do this character hold justice in the religious text, because destruction also allows for new birth and life, right? It's a very important part of the cycle. So it's not just destruction; it also strongly implies a reawakening. So Shiva comes through and destroys at certain points of evolution to allow the fertile ground for the next incarnation to take place and for us to learn the next lessons. And there's certain lessons. So if we live in the post-Atlantean period now, where Steiner places us in time, is that there's 7 epochs in the post-Atlantean after the Great Flood. And so this place is about like 10,000 BC, literally, or 12,000 years ago. And that would be the ancient Indian civilization, the ancient Persian epoch, the Egypto-Chaldean epoch, the Greco-Roman, and then the present. And during each of these epochs, Steiner argues that human thought was concerned with different things. And so the ancient Indian group is writing down this original like religionness, right? And we inherit the Bhagavad Gita and these different works where it's kind of...
Does he leave out the Mesoamericans, by the way?
No, he talks about the Mesoamericans. So the 7th epoch is supposed to be the Americas. The 6th is supposed to center around Russia. And that there's
By the way, where's he getting this stuff? Where's he?
So exactly, that body of information that I didn't respect before, of basically being in a trance and kind of channeling information. And so Steiner says that channeling is actually out of time and place, because you're not supposed to be channeling some other entity. You're supposed to be using that same mind state, but you be the driver, right? You're doing this yourself. So people that channel are a little bit out of time and place, but it's the same kind of concept where you're interacting with some information body that might be like remote viewing the future or remote viewing the past, and you're supposed to be in control and like driving this. Right. But where is he getting this information? It's the mixture of texts and what these ancient texts say, and then also his own explorations and his own like inner spirit and writing that down. Right. So it's really important that you ask that, because clearly everyone's mileage may vary with this. If you're looking for this kind of information that isn't as objective as the scientific information that we normally like to have, where it's very material, can write it down, we can all from different points of view agree on the same thing. This is much, much more like personal and a lot more inner exploration. But Rudolph Steiner is this big proponent of spiritual science, which implies this kind of rigor. And this kind of rigor is that that's why this hierarchy exists, is that you have a place and you have a thing you're supposed to be doing on it. And that's why it's not just freedom everywhere. There's something like happening here in order to it.
So let's talk about his predictions for our present moments.
Right. So his predictions for our present moments are Rudolph Steiner is talking and sharing his work in like 1905, like the beginning of the century, until like a bit after the 1920s. And so he goes through like a world war, and this is like an interesting time for the world. And from this, now's a good time to kind of chat a little bit about religious figures and lead up to the present day. So Rudolph Steiner is saying that the important things that humanity is doing in the ancient Indian epoch is religion and like realizing that the world is Maya. And what this means is that the world is an illusion, and that everything we see is kind of a spiritual hallucination or a dream or an illusion to reveal something important. And so all these teachings are about like seeing past the material world, seeing that is a dream, that is Maya. The ancient Persian group followed, and that I don't know too much about these, and that then after that was the Egypto-Chaldean group. And so from Sumeria and Egyptian groups, you see a lot of working with the stars, right? Like trying to record and astrology and these kinds of interacting with the heavens in this way. And then the Greco-Roman period comes, and the Greco-Roman period is very much about developing the personality and logic. And so a change of how you move through the world from there. And various like religious entities like the Buddha, right? These people incarnate at times through history. And there was this issue where the people in the Eastern schools are getting really good at realizing that the world is Maya, right? So you wake up, you realize the world is a dream, and that you've like succeeded, you've organized your spiritual body, and you die. But there's an issue with this, is that you don't buy into the experience. You don't buy into the simulation. You're not playing the game, right? You're just realizing, oh, it's a game, I'm done. And you quit playing, right? And so it's really hard, it's profound to get to that point where you realize that it's an illusion. But then when you just opt out, you're not doing anything, right? You're not doing as much spiritual growth now, right? So this is the essence of why Jesus Christ had to like come in this theology or mythology, is that the change of thought of humanity at the time, and you kind of get this from reading the Bhagavad Gita, and all these things are like very worldly, very ethereal ways of looking at things. But then you read the Bible, and it's like fire and brimstone and really emotional and with it, right? And this was the appropriate evolution of thought at the time, was to really buy into the illusion, right? We're here for a purpose. We're here to do something. And so now we go from here, from before seeing past the illusion, now to trying to work with the illusion. And that Jesus Christ provides a powerful force to provide this impulse to humanity. And he talks a lot about impulses, which are kind of these forces or ideas. Again, we're supposed to have these particular kinds of ideas that we contemplate and integrate into ourselves. And this comes in the force of these impulses through humanity and through time. And so Jesus Christ was previously apparently incarnations of the Buddha. But then now there's a transformation of thought that humanity needs, and that is like buy into this illusion of Maya to do the inner work that we need on ourselves. And so that leads us to this like present day, where now Rudolph Steiner is 1910s, looking around the world, lots of lot happening. The First World War happens on his watch, and so people have to like deal with this. And he describes these different mystery schools. This might be jumping ahead, but these different groups of humans who have this spiritual awareness of these ideas that I've been talking about, like the Bhagavad Gita. And so theosophy is this religion that comes up in the 1800s, and theosophy is what Rudolph Steiner originally was. And this is effectively taking the Eastern teachings and introducing them to the West. So theosophy is effectively translating Eastern material, and now Europe is becoming aware of this through theosophy. And there's a break between theosophy and Rudolph Steiner, and this is what creates Rudolph Steiner's material, which is anthroposophy. And so anthroposophy is really centering humanity in the center of this, like, and accepting or integrating the character of Christ into this cosmology that was largely Eastern, and so now it's giving it like that Western bend. And so
can you real quick remind me the purpose of the Christ in this progression was this idea of transcendence above that baseline?
Of internal work, because it sounds like the Eastern philosophies tend to be about,
like, you realize it's a dream, fair, but then you're like, playing. I can do something with this dream. I see.
So this is the point of Jesus Christ, is to, I guess, like, buy into this. And so the story is that Jesus is a person that was born in the Essenian mystery schools, and that he was prepared to receive this thing called the Christ consciousness. And so in his 30th year, the Christ consciousness came into his body, and effectively it kind of transformed him. And the next 3 years, from 30 to 33, he has the Christ being in him. So the Christ part of Jesus Christ. And the Christ being is effectively a manifestation of the spiritual entity that is our son, like, coming through. And so when Christ is killed and his blood seeps into the earth, this effectively changes the mythology, is that it changes humanity, where we're now, we have the ability to change ourselves from within as opposed to without. We have the godliness of power within. And so before, a mystery school would, and a mystery school, I think, is like this really interesting idea of organizing teaching around ideas as opposed to answers. And I think that's really cool. But these mystery schools would keep these mythologies and interpret. So before, if you would want to be initiated, you would have to have a rite performed on you. And so this would be like John the Baptist. Something would have to happen to you by another person for you to make that change within yourself. But after Jesus Christ's ordeal, now anyone can make that change within themselves. You don't need to be, you don't need the outside force. So this is where the change comes from within. The God is within. Right now, at this point in human evolution, you don't have any excuse, right? It's all you. And this is really, really hard, but also allows for this individuation. So we're no longer these, like, in this sense, this Lemurian consciousness where you're kind of hive mind controlling these Sims figures. You're now actually in your body, right? And you're feeling things very, very differently. And so naturally one would behave really differently. And we have these really different feelings and desires that we need to reconcile with each other. Now that we're seeing back and really buying into this. And so this is where Rudolph Steiner finds himself in the 1900s too, right? He's trying to now highlight the importance of the Christ character in this Eastern, largely stemming tradition or philosophy, and looking at the world and all the, like, hatred and violence that's going on, and trying to understand this. And he has this, he says in some of his lectures that anthroposophy now, like, it doesn't make much sense, but in 100 years, it'll have this reawakening. And it's kind of funny that he talks about this and this idea of prophecy of, like, what will happen in 100 years that will be changing or significant. And so at this present point where we're supposed to, like, develop our ego and ourselves, he starts to talk about this future version of humanity that is in danger of getting caught in this, like, tangled web, this spider's web that you talk about. And he uses all these metaphors and illusions that's really hard to get at. And I think that it's really important to be kind of in the mindset of someone in 1910s and hearing Rudolph Steiner talk about this ethereal web that humanity will be tangled up in. And it makes
and these spider creatures. Sense. Literally, he talks about spider creatures that are going to come down and take over the earth.
They will come down and take over the earth and gobble us up in this web that we'll have a really hard time disentangling, right? So this metaphor is, frankly, probably, like, nonsensical to, like, many people at the time. And so Rudolph Steiner says, like, anthroposophy may not make much sense now, but in 100 years, there'll be a place for this. And so now it's 100 years later, we're talking, like, what's changed? And the answer is, to me, like, my own interpretation is kind of this idea of AI, but this idea of technology is really this, like, spider.
The World Wide Web.
the World Wide Web.
But
And
also
so
governments, right? So he's alive at the time of the First World War, and it's hard to imagine in the aftermath of that you don't begin to see the immense power that's going to come from these collaborations of nations that now have more resources than ever before because they're mechanical, they're industrialized, they can produce massive quantities of goods and armaments, and they're interconnected through their resources. And so the idea of this spider's web that you can never escape makes a lot of sense just in the sense of geopolitics alone. And he seems like he was really widely read.
He is, and he was like a classically trained philosopher, right? This is a person who went to school and was well known at that until he became known as like a mad occultist, right? So this, I think, is also why, as a scientist, I really like this Steiner material because of this like rigor and language he uses, and it's like blatantly speaking the same language I speak, right? And so this is, of course, why I like tend to like trust him more, right? Just that personal bias. But yeah, you don't need to invoke much to like have this metaphor of like seeing where we are now with this like entangled web. But he does actually say like beings will come down and will have to be very wary of how like caught up we get in this web. And I think that it's really important because he does also talk a lot about governmental systems and ideal ways of how society should be run, one that reflects the lessons that you're supposed to learn at the time, right? So there's a time of humanity where the idea of in Lemuria, it's very tribal. And at the point of Atlantis was to make a place where all these tribes could come together and like rigorize humanity, right? We could all blend. And so, of course, this is like not fun. There's a fight, and then there's a destruction of, I believe he said, Lemuria, fires from Lemuria, and that the Atlantean civilizations kind of like left over from this, but that the Atlanteans had their own downfall, their own lesson to learn. And so like we've existed with governments before, and it's like, how does the government reflect a human's ability to like learn the lessons that they need? And right now, if we have lots of centralization, it's getting tangled up in that web. It's really hard to individuate and to be your own ego when you have, blatantly like a democracy, right? And some level, democracy is like this averaging function where there's a little, like a small area where we can all kind of have this common ground. But if you want to leave that common ground or have a very much more personal thought, the system of governments inherently like fights that. And so there might be like a time and place to employ these different ideas. And so now as we have these really centralizing governments, it becomes really, really hard to have individual freedom as you might like expect it to sometimes. And so he paints this story of how there's a really common practice of, you have one kind of normal political party and then one very extreme political party. And so you can get really a lot of people to go to the normal political party by having an extreme one in comparison. And that this seems to have traveled with humanity for a long, long time. And so he calls names to this. And so I think that it's reasonable to imagine us being caught up in this web as being involved in these like governmental systems. But I think that there's also another odder version of this interpretation it's referencing these beings coming down and having to integrate with us, and that there are beings that are normal that should be integrating, and this would be like the spiritual beings, basically exalted versions of humanity in the future that one should like listen to their lessons from. And so these are kind of the sightings of saints, right? These kinds of things, these famous ideas where you might have, or someone who says like an alien visits them and they say that they're from Venus. But Venus is one of these future human planets. And so we might be like, because my original interpretation is Venus is not where beings live. I don't know, like we would know, we could visit Venus, right? But the less literal and then the more esoteric version of that is that they're from the Venus chapter of human evolution, right? They're telling you at what time and place they are. And so there's certain beings where they come down, they share their knowledge, they help us individuate, and we go on. But there's also a darker side, right? We have a darker side of us. So there's these other beings that will come down, and these like spider-like beings will be this web that we'll have a hard time disentangling ourselves from. And I think that this makes a lot of sense for like the gray beings and AI, where we are now kind of integrating. And Steiner talks about this electric apocalypse kind of idea. When you have an idea and you put it into a computer, it kind of, or you write it down, it loses its, all the infinite possibility that it could be is now kind of a hollow thing, right? And this is the issue of virtual reality. If you have a tree in the wild, you can study this infinitely and all of its fractal depth. But as soon as you have a tree in Minecraft, you can only interact with that in a very few ways, right? You kind of lose a huge facet of this. So when we start to digitize ideas and make these, beings that are, AI, he's implying that we lose something very, very fundamental. I think it's that spark, that godly like spark of life. And to me, this kind of goes back to, as introduced earlier, of the real world having this like quantum random chaosness, whereas when you then put that into a machine like a computer, you kind of end up with this like Newtonian perfect future, right? You kind of lose some of the noise that makes you interesting. And these beings, they don't have their own godly power to survive. And this, so they need they basically are parasites of humanity. And this kind of sounds...
Man, it reminds me of this conversation we had with Diana Pasulka, where she was talking about interviewing indigenous Americans about their perspectives on UFOs. And because there's this long-standing myth in a number of different tribes of these star beings that come down, which sounds very similar. But the funny thing is she recounted these stories of people, these indigenous people saying, well, they're already here. And she's like, well, where are they? And they point to her cell phone, essentially, or they're pointing at this evolution of this technological beings, right? This, right. In some sense, they're pointing to the magic that's appearing in our everyday world, which seems to have like a motivation system of its own, right?
Kind of. I think that this comes back to what I've tried to express before about the nature of evolution, which is that evolution is goal-directed behavior, and you align yourself with the things in your environment that feel like they're most useful. The human spirit must have appeared eons before the first physical human arrived, because every single creature in that chain, all the way back to the very first organisms on Earth, had to have been making decisions that gradually led them to becoming tool-wielding hairless apes. That is
searching for purpose too, right? You go back to these Homo naledies and so forth with their burial rituals like eons ago.
Cave art, all of these things. We're representational creatures that have been searching for patterns in the abstract, predicting eclipses, looking at lunar cycles, cataloging, and placing meaning onto it. And so this couples tightly into the narratives that we've heard from Ogi, from Andres about DMT entities, where there is not a single point towards which one can evolve. There is, right. We are the last common ancestor for something that is yet to come.
That's really interesting. I never thought of it in that way.
Many, many things, right? Like we are a radiation. So, I mean, obviously in the tree of life, there's plenty of things that just form, never evolve into anything else, and the shape dies. That does happen.
But when you talk about these AI beings, or whatever the hell they are, the future, the beings that emerge from the web, whatever that web is, what I mean when I say they seem to possess their own motivational structures is that, like, why do people want all of these entities? Because they're good workers. They serve efficiency and growth, and they have that's what I'm pointing at.
Well, they're trying to create a god. The idea is AGI,
a god that will serve them, right?
I actually think that in the most extreme cases, it is a god that they will serve, because the AI will tell them what to do. The idea is that you create a sufficiently advanced computer, and the computer knows what is the best choice, because we talked earlier about purpose.
Which t-shirt should I wear today?
Yeah, exactly. It's what should your outfit look like? What should you do today? What should you eat? There will be a machine that can look into you, know who you are, know your goals, and then tell you exactly what to do in order to achieve them. It is ultimate and perfect order.
And that's squared off, it seems like, face to face with the cosmology that Gigi Young is promoting, which says that, no, you actually know what you should eat. You just don't realize it. Or you know what you should wear. You need to listen to yourself or is that a fair statement?
Completely. Absolutely. And my personal experience too, right, with that is that why do I want an AI for my research? Because it can do the thing I can't do. But Gigi's Young is saying like you can do that thing. You just have to like build yourself to there, right? And so go
I
ahead.
don't know about that. Like, I think that there are very real, and not specifically about you. Like, maybe you can do the thing that you're commissioning the AI to do, but I think that there are very, very real limitations that humans have always had to wrestle with. And there is this seductive cosmology that says, no, you contain within yourself infinite potential, and if you just focus yourself on developing that potential, you will be able to do whatever it is that you want to do. And I have a much more pessimistic worldview on that, which is that you are limited. There are like when current flows through a circuit, it flows through a specific path.
Right. And so how do you overcome your limitations to you then in this world?
I mean, I think that there are limitations that cannot be overcome, but I think that those limitations are generally much farther away than we realize. But the idea of an infinite, the seductive pull of an infinite potential is what creates the desire to generate AGI. Because you're like, if I can't do it, I can apply myself to creating an external system that is sufficiently advanced and sufficiently functional and fed with every single piece of information that we have ever generated, which will be able to see the patterns, and just like AlphaFold predict the structure, it will predict my life. And that will be good, because then we will always make the best possible choice. And there will be no war, there will be no hunger, there will be no suffering, there will be just good.
Yeah, that's a beautiful outcome. Yeah.
It is, but then there's the question of the material world and our relation to it, because it implies that we abandon the physical and become just informational. Because it seems like transhumanism is a passage into integrating with the machine, and once the machine is able to build and maintain itself, then the physical body of the human no longer becomes necessary. And so that seems like a branch point in evolution, where on one hand, there is a flow of people into that web that are dedicated fully and wholly to creating it. There's a flow of people that are in opposition to that web, that are the, trad life return to the earth crew. And they will continue to evolve. And if there's some kind of material catastrophe, that will choose who survives that filter and who will be the radiating ancestor for all of the evolutionary species that come.
Yeah. And so if I take the picture that you described, which again is like very close to how I see it, how the like grays or spider beings or AGI, artificial general intelligence, might see this like splitting is again, there's going to be like that word, the world will be like washed clean, but you can still exist because you've stored yourself, that information of your being, in this like hardware that can like potentially keep going around, right? Whereas the people who've returned to the earth, you're wiped off and then that's it, right? The other people inherit the earth. And so,
but it's hard for me to imagine a true catastrophe, a massive solar storm coupled to some kind of impact. The technological web can't survive that. But the people that know how to farm the earth actually can. And so to me, and they have more children.
Yeah.
And so you have this really interesting thing where if you fully vest yourself in the technology, and that is the direction of evolution, I think you've created a very, very fragile point, because what happens when the internet goes out? What happens when your Internet of Things, where everything is connected to a central system, is sufficiently disrupted that the system can no longer run? Without a YouTube video that tells you how to change the oil filter in your car, or fix your washing machine, or how to grow a garden, you have no knowledge whatsoever, because everything that used to be within you is now distributed into the network, and the survival of the network is the only thing that matters, and you're kind of this just bleb on the surface of it. And that seems to me like a much more fragile state than somebody who's like, well, no, I know how to fix my car, I know how to build a house, I know how to wire it, I know plumbing, I can do all of this stuff without the trappings of modernity even.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And I think that this is the this is what the Material and Gigi Young allude to, is that it's so comforting to buy into the technological thing because it seems like it fixes your problems right now, but it makes you fragile in the future because it makes you dependent on a system outside yourself for your well-being. Whereas the Steiner Material and Gigi Young, their personal philosophy is one of cultivating the inner ability to handle anything that comes up yourself. And part of this is that this concept of like cities in yoga, right? And so this is in Bhagavad Gita, where if you you basically do the work on yourself enough, you get to unlock these seeming like mystical qualities. And so the religious texts will literally talk about people like saints being in two places at once, or chatting, or remote viewing, or literally flying, or healing yourself. All these kinds of cities available. And so this is the same thing that technology can do, right? You can get all of this through technology. But the trick that anthroposophy claims is that if you do the inner work yourself, you have access to all that with your being, that your humanity itself is already capable of all of that if you find your way to that. And the point of our evolution is to find our way to that path. But there's a really quick offshoot. You can not do the work, and you can pick up the cell phone, you can do the technology and have the AGI give all that information for you. But yeah, that evolves you to a different kind of fragility than the other one. And so the ultimate point of a lot of these religious teachings, so anthroposophy, esoteric Christianity, but also other things have this name for it, is this idea of your diamond body, or as you're evolving and going through incarnations, you're working on your soul. And so your soul will become this eternal thing that will live on through time, right? So that when that huge disaster comes to the earth and wipes it clean, you won't need the earth anymore. You will have materialized past your need to be incarnated on earth. And so in this sense, you've developed your soul body to be immortal. And this is kind of the idea of what the resurrection of Jesus Christ is alluding to, is that he no longer needs his body. And so he lives eternally because he did the work on himself. And that this, plays in nicely with the second law of information thermodynamics, right? Where at a certain point, you can retain that information like infinitely after a certain point, or many other religious teachings of like cycles of reincarnation leading to like seeing beyond and not having to reincarnate anymore. Or even the New Age, this idea of people will call like becoming fourth or fifth dimensional, or Bashar will even talk about humans not needing to be physical anymore, and you become beyond physical. And so it is this thing that is,
or just even on your own little lifetime, right? It's like,
yeah,
I don't know. We think a lot about just lying on our deathbeds, hopefully many years from now. But
right.
What's it like? Are you ready? Have you done what you wanted to do the way that you wanted to do it? And if so, maybe you have some permission to leave the physical form at that point.
Right. And if you've gotten caught in this web of government or other things, maybe it's really hard to have that, right? Maybe that's very, very scary. And so this kind of central thing that seems to be central to like the Greys mythology or all these is this like intense fear of dying. You're like immortal in the technique, but the thing is that they're like never dying. They're always like cloning themselves and coming back the same. And that's not evolution, right? And this idea that there's this interesting like mechanics that gets stuck in my head, where if you die and go to heaven and you get like anything you want, as soon as you think it shows up. Like not only is it really hard to do work on yourself because there's no consequences, it's also really hard to communicate because you're like always talking past someone. You have the perfect idea in your head and it just like doesn't matter. Everything's like communicated perfectly. But when you're incarnated on Earth, in a like material world, things break down at the scale of an atom. So you can't like have an idea that doesn't like somehow become quantized as opposed to like infinite, right? And I think that this means that we have to talk to each other, and it's imperfect, right? It's always going to be an imperfect idea that's being communicated because of the like quantized nature of our reality, as opposed to being like differentiable or whatever, just infinite. And this mechanism seems very, very important, but you can, the idea of anthroposophy is that you can work on yourself to kind of go past your need to do this. And so I think that it's really curious how both cosmologies, like these alien beings where you just clone yourself and you're immortal in that way, versus this other cosmology where you work on your soul and then you're immortal that way. And the thing about the alien beings that you always need technology on some level to either clone yourself or to hold your consciousness in a computer, whereas the other one relies completely on this like seemingly intangible information system, where you are like a much more robust version of immortal in their mind, in the esoteric Christianity mind, whereas the Greys would consider you dead. Right. And these two cosmologies seem to look at the same series of concepts from wildly different like meanings to themselves. Yeah.
I propose we take a pee break really quickly,
Yeah.
and then we see if we can land this.
Yeah. See what happens with that. That sounds excellent.
I wonder if it'd be rude if I started bringing like a jar of peanut butter to the show with me.
I think that it's important to just set that precedent now. You're going to pave the way for future people. I feel like I needed that. Yeah. To eat a tablespoon an hour, or otherwise I'll waste away.
Yeah, it's amazing how a couple of spoonfuls of peanut butter will just power you into, buy you a little bit of time anyways.
That's all I'm looking for. Just 2 more minutes, deep breath.
All right, so this is really interesting. So we paused on this dichotomy between this techno-cosmology and this more naturalist, humanist, I don't know the good word
spiritualist. For it. Spiritualist. It's the taking care of something immaterial. Right? It's almost like the material versus the immaterial.
But it seems to be the crisis of our times. And I don't know about other times. Maybe it's always been the crisis of the times, but it seems, particularly with the acceleration of the internet, online life, working at screens, seems like there's a real tension between those two cosmologies today. What do you think? Is it? It seems more intense than when I was a kid, but maybe I was just oblivious because I was a kid.
Yeah, I think it's really more intense. I think kind of Stein would put it as like the lessons of our time to learn, right? Like the materialistic science that gives us, or the like Newtonian clockwork view of the world that gives us our outlook today. It necessarily probably didn't exist back then in the same way. And he even talks about like what confronted us was different. So people wouldn't question the existence of like God or spiritualism because it was so much more tangible. And he would even go so far as to like the organs or what you have in your body would work with that. Whereas today, we're really, really separated from this way of being. And so it is of our time to recognize that and buy back. And I think now it's more intense than when I was a kid, because I think now, like, I allude to the 2022 Nobel Prize, right? Like this really just cements the rigor at which this mystery exists, right? They tried to find so many loopholes or outs for information transfer and where it could be hiding. And when we were young, I think that like we just we kind of assumed it'd work out with our own like biases to whatever that would be. But now we've gotten so good at measuring, and we're so like lost with that, right? I can't even come up, I think in the sciences, the medical sciences, we're really, really good at sequencing genes right now. Our technology is really good at doing that. So almost every experiment is like sequencing something, or many are. And then does that ever like answer a question? Almost always in my experience, sequencing one thing leads to like, what's the next gene we have to sequence, right? So you fix this little problem, but it makes another one over here, right? It seems really hard to get to the end of these questions. They just get so detailed, nitty gritty. And I think that this causes us, at least in me, to kind of like wake up for a second. And this, manifested literally as my water journey, right? Trying to find another physical answer for the same set of questions. But in the same sect, it also manifests as this like spiritual journey, trying to answer the same problem from like a different set of questions or approaches. And this really gave me this like profound interest in this concept of mystery schools, of how you pass down information or theories of thought. And because what happened was how I was trying to tackle things in the sciences was you like have these nouns, or you're looking for these nouns as answers. And this leads to a really particular way of thinking that it's hard to envision like ending, because as soon as you like have a drug that fixes one thing, our experience is now that like it makes the problem somewhere else. Right? And I think that it's on our time to really re-examine where this line of thinking takes us. Because we've come up to where the problems are with this line of thinking, right? It solves so many things: washing machines, automobiles, right? We have so much free time now. In this sense, like we're of course like tied to our wages and health insurance in other ways. But in the promise is that technology was supposed to give us a lot of personal thought and freedom. And so then when we get to like revel in that personal thought and freedom, we tend to seem to come across this spiritual question. At least that's how it presented to me. I'm not sure if it was similar for you, but
Well, yeah,
but
because
yeah,
you have all this spare time. You have the ability to choose how you spend it, and how you spend it has almost an infinite number of answers. And so then
right.
the
So which one's the
question,
right?
exactly, and so the question becomes, what is the right answer? And that's a deeply spiritual question. That's the one that cannot be driven just by material in motion. Nobody's ever,
And
ever gotten to the bottom of what the right answer is, what the good answer
right.
is.
Yeah, and I think this is where we are exactly right now in Steiner's cosmology is we're reveling in this individual freedom. And it's so wonderful we've gotten to experience it for a while, but then it kind of leaves this thing that we come up against. And it's like, what should we be doing with our freedom? What's the play now? And I think that this is just like this crisis where we're at. And why now the like new age is picking up so much, right? People are really looking for this ancient aliens. Like people are like fascinated by this. It's all these other explanations of our origins and what we're supposed to be doing here. And yeah, I think everyone comes up with their own answer, but it's really interesting how what you're supposed to be doing changes with the stories that you're told. And how I kind of like the example I like for this is when Europeans came to North America or Americas, there's like letters of the founding fathers that they write where they say like a squirrel could go across the entire like north to south without ever touching the ground, right? This place was so densely and naturally forested. Everywhere in Europe is a planned forest, right? Humans have touched the entirety of the landscape for thousands of years. But America had what Europeans thought of like as true nature. And now the reveal is that it wasn't necessarily true nature. The indigenous people here numbered in the millions. And of course, just how they interact with their environment was different. There's ideas that like the Amazon forest is actually kind of cultivated in many ways by humans. The Brazil nut is so widely spread that it seems like we are farming it. And so there's all these aspects now where we're realizing that America wasn't just this wild, untamed wilderness. It was a highly populated, highly cultivated wilderness. And it's revealed to us that the stories that the natives told caused them to have different behavior than the Europeans who came across looking for something had, right? So the stories, the cosmology that we tell ourselves have profound impacts on how we move through the world and how we treat it, right? It can literally keep the continent green, or it could, do the opposite, right? And so finding the right story to tell ourselves matters a lot for our comfort and how we move through the world. I think that's kind of what we're searching for now.
And
It's
I
like the
think
right
that,
story to tell ourselves.
yeah, but I think that it's really tricky because I can imagine a world where, let's say, Native American cosmology and metaphysics is not overtaken by this European extractionist cosmology.
Right.
But do we have cars and molecular medicine and airplane rides that let you go anywhere in the world in 15 hours? Do we go to space?
Right.
Maybe not. Maybe we remain this very ecological, low technology society that cultivates the wilderness but doesn't use it.
There's plenty of those in
Right.
the Amazon, from what I hear.
Right. And so I think that there's a really uncomfortable future. The same way that it's not possible for a creature like us to survive without killing things. You can be vegetarian, you can be
Yeah.
vegan, you're still killing things. And you
Absolutely.
can tell the story that the plants don't have an inner life and they don't suffer, and fine, maybe, but you're still killing things. You've
Absolutely.
just put it on the ladder of what's okay to kill
Everybody
instead
gotta
of
eat
that's not.
somebody.
So everybody's got to eat somebody. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
that to me seems like the question that we must wrestle with, which is that knowing that we must consume the material world in order to produce anything on the other side that we want, what are the rules by which we choose to produce with the recognition of wanting more than just the things themselves? We want the woods, we want the animals, we want this balanced ecosphere, we want a condition where humans don't have to do crummy jobs all day long in order to just let the
Right.
machine go. Or there's no
Yeah.
child slaves in the Congo digging out cobalt. Like, we want a world that has the technology and also meets those other spiritual requirements. And that's the challenge, because plenty of people will suggest that the goal is to return, abandon the technology, abandon the internet, go back, live traditionally, end of story. And I'm like, I never think that the answer is to go back. You cannot step in the same river twice.
I think you have to really just dig for what is motivating that lashing out, right? What's missing in those people that makes them want to burn it all down? I'm sure we've all experienced some glimmer of that at some point in our lives. We're like, wouldn't it be better if it just wasn't this disgusting city here, or whatever it is, right? It's deeply it's deeply misanthropic, but it appears, I think, from time to time, and some people it can possess them entirely. I think that's how you end up with school shooters and
absolutely
Ted Kaczynski and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it is kind of, or even earlier when we were like talking about the movie, like resist versus integration. I think that there's people who like resist, and they're the only play is to like go back to how it was before. But I think that like anthroposophy and the spiritual science put forward by these people is that's not the answer. The answer is not to reject it, it's to integrate it, right? And so you have this godly power and you're trying to exercise it. You're trying to figure out what to do with this now. And we're just really now getting to this awareness of how much power we really have, right? The dawn of AGI, all these things like to even like predict what we can do in the future is folly. It's like absurd, the possibilities, right? And so I think that the point of anthroposophy is the reminder that integration is important. So we can't just reject that we've made this progression, right? We have to figure out how we keep the internet and the woods. We try and figure out how we keep like our progress and the things that we want to be like heading to. We don't just give it up and go backwards. That's like deeply turning your back on the natural evolution of spirit, right? You're not godly because you reject something. You're godly because you overcome it, I think, from these schools. And that's why I really like them, is because I think that a lot of the new age stuff that I've been accustomed to was absolving people of personal responsibility, whereas this one is an entire school thought about cultivating personal responsibility. And this is also what Steiner, like when he's talking about anthroposophy as a place 100 years in the future, the other things that Steiner did with his life after like being an academic and going off into these, occult schools, was he put forward the Waldorf school system and this idea of biodynamic gardening. And so in his, as he puts it, looking forward to the future, what would we need in 100 years? His answers are the Waldorf school system and biodynamic gardening, right? I think both these are really interesting because how we always thought of like our food supply as like monocropping, having, clear cutting an area, having fertilizer, and just like a few things that you regrow there. And this is excellent because you can harvest so much wheat and you can have like 10% of your population feed 90% for the first time in human history, right? Extraordinary. But there's cost too, right? Like the earth slowly dies when you do that. You have to use fertilizer, you have to do all these things. So Steiner is like feeding forward and looking forward into this, especially at the dawn of World War I, where you have fertilizer, but also nitrogen for bombs. Those two travel hand in hand, right? And so biodynamic gardening as a response of how would we grow and interact with the world while actually maximizing what these systems want to do naturally and finding our place within them. And again, that kind of sounds like, as I talked about earlier with astrology, you're not trying to reject fate, you're trying to find your place in fate, right? And so he's like really surrendering to this. Steiner could have done anything with his time, and he chose gardening and school system as two things he really cared about to like give to humanity. I think that we're not here to copy Steiner. We're here to like try to understand why did he like see what we needed, what did he answer to himself as what we needed.
Well, it's
and
cultivation on both sides, right?
Exactly, right. And so we're gardeners, we're curators, right? Like on some level, the sun spits out a crazy number of photons of all different kind of colors, and that they hit the earth, they get stored in some sugar, and you decide where that energy, as it breaks down, enters your body. You get to decide where that ends up, right? You get to put it in the different bins as it goes down. And eventually that energy will heat decay and run into a black hole and become trapped forever in some 2D hologram or whichever, right?
Maybe.
But maybe could be it, could be many things.
I'll start on that one. Yes.
Some say.
Yeah. Some say. Some cosmologists.
No, but that's actually a great transition, because the question is science, right? You do science professionally. right? We do science unprofessionally. We all love science, right? And so
Right.
the question is, what is your science motivated by? What are you
Yeah,
cultivating, or what are you doing?
that's right. And I think that's really important. And that's where we're stuck now. Kind of what I said about earlier when I was trying to think in my science, what was an experiment I could do that did just lead to another experiment, right? What was like a gene I could sequence without then having to sequence the other genes that like respond to that one? And it becomes really hard, especially when our materialist science kind of tells us how much the material world like betrays what we expect, right? A particle is a lot more ephemeral and airy than maybe like I treat it normally. In my mind, I know that to be a fact, but I still and then like working with these particles. And I think that this is one where this is like the task of our generation now. And if we zoom out and look at what New Age people say about like different ages, if we're entering the Aquarian age, it's the air element. It's a lot airier. It's etherization. It's weirder. That's what they say. And I didn't like copy this down and be like, I'm adopting their view. I just naturally through my science is like, I think that we need something weirder, right? I search for interesting water science. I search for different things. And I think that the tricky part is that our scientific system makes it really hard right now. It's very hard to try and seek out something new or unknown. Most of what we do is actually engineering problems of refining an idea versus like science of exploring. And I kind of tend to think of this really curious concept of like stable and unstable systems from the engineering term of art. And stable system is something that self-corrects. And so like an airplane, a Boeing 747, or American democracy is a pretty stable system, hard to perturb. And then, but if you want a fighter jet, you don't want a stable system because if you want to turn quickly, you don't want to fight the stability of your system. Or if you like let go of the car wheel and you just hit the gas, it'll go back to straight, right? This is a stable system. And so we've been stable for a
Not
long
our
time.
Honda.
God bless. Yeah. It might be a tricky Honda problem to sort out. And there's like, and so there's immense danger to having unstable systems, right? You don't really know where you're going to go, but there's also immense power. You get to like get off the track. If you know your track's headed somewhere and you don't want to be on that, then the one thing you have to do
They
is something
age
different,
too, I
right?
guess, is part of this, right? That's what I was pointing out with our Honda. It's like this ancient machine at this point, right? And
I
so
guess I
things
did.
lose their ability to self-correct over time, perhaps.
Yeah,
Not
that's
trying to
very
just
fair.
derail you, but
No, but that's perfect. Like it ages out of time. And this again is the point of like the spiritual sciences is that you have to be in time. So Rudolph Steiner didn't just like wake up and be like, I'm going to tell the world how to uh ascend to Jupiter 1,000 years in the future. He was thinking 100 years in the future, right? He was thinking of much more practical timelines. And I think that is also like on our when we're trying to figure out what it is we can be doing. Uh, I if you talk way too far in the future, people don't understand you. I think that this has come up in like in science before, right? If your idea is too cutting edge, too new, it just sounds preposterous, right? It takes a long time for quantum mechanics to catch on. It takes a long time for these things to happen.
hand washing,
And
for
we
God's sake.
you say hand
Hand
that's
washing
right.
in the surgery clinic, yeah.
What the most absurd story ever. A bunch of arrogant people, yeah, not listening to data. We're not that different in sciences than we were 200 years ago, making those same judgments, right? Uh, in some ways, we like to think of ourselves as above, but we are very much in this like stable system, this very conservative, slowly building ideas. And what if like some of the ideas that we integrated early on really fight the change that we need in the future? Right? So really at this place to now zoom out and kind of reestablish and pick and choose. And I think that the issue that we run into socially is that we're so quick to tell each other why something won't work or why they're wrong. And I think that this is an
Guilty.
issue because, right, we can prove that of anything. We're experts at dissecting an idea down and breaking it down, right? But I think that the future is being an expert, like building something up. And the idea is that breaking things down it's very useful, but you can break down anything and you can kind of like prove anything. And so at this point, like, what's the thing I care to prove? And Steiner said that I care to like rigorize gardening and education. And that was really what he saw as like pertinent. So I tend to think that we all have these bends in ourselves that we care a lot about and that we have a lot of purchase on. For me, like I think I always like loved chemistry. I'm always going to do chemistry, right? But the goal of humanity is not for everyone to become a badass chemist, right? And this is also part of the Christ's role in the world, is that when we all individuate, we all have our individual special thing to contribute to the whole, and that it becomes really tricky when we try and have dictation, like what's the school syllabus, right? It's kind of dictating what superiority is, what we value, what these things are, and this really fights against the individual nature that we have and we're exploring right now. And there is right, so on our age we have to do a lot of integrating of these things. We've now have a lot of experience where we see how these things don't align, and now we have to unsort that out. And I don't think that there's a right answer, and so it'll take many people trying many different things and lots of trial and error, and that this requires a different perspective that we have when engaging with each other in these kinds of conversations. Because as before, growing up in science, right, I was looking for the theory of everything. And now I think that there's many same theories of everything that basically all describe the same thing. And so I'm not too worried in picking my favorite horse. I'll just use what's most useful to me in this instant, right? And so I'm just not going to interact much to try and nickel or dime someone for their favorite theory or for the perfect theory of everything. Right? I will change my behavior based upon these experiences. I think that also gets to the thing you're saying, is scientists are so often, and I thought this is removed from reality, right? You're this objective observer from this perfectly stable place. And I think that you two talk about this too while you're on the road. And this is kind of what Ayn Rand's essays get at too, is said that we do enter in with a morality, and our morality is kind of telling us what's good and bad, what should we be doing with our time. And so I can help farming by doing better genetic engineering, and this is kind of a Monsanto play, but also maybe even just upbreeding wheat and barley to get bigger grains kind of play, right? Or I can have a different approach, and so Steiner's approach is one of cooperativity of what is this plant missing to grow large? Maybe it needs a community around it, right? And so you're answering the same question, but through a different set of, you're going to explore a different search space for the answer to that question with Steiner's lens versus a geneticist lens. And the point is not necessarily to choose your superior lens, it's to understand this and adopt what you need at the time that best suits you. And I think that this kind of runs
and to be conscious, right? Just to be awake and make those decisions at each point along the way. I really feel like if you take Ayn Rand most generously, that's all she's saying is stay awake. Don't just do something because someone gave you a few dollars to do it. That's not good enough, especially because you guys are the smartest. She's talking to scientists at MIT. She's you're the brightest bulbs in the shed, you need to actually pay attention to what you're doing with that really hot filament.
Right. And how I grew up was I was so afraid of being a failure and not earning enough money from the world I grew up on. That kind of being a scientist was a way where I could be accepted and get a wage and do what I want. And it's easier for science in some ways because the world has said it wants scientists. But if it's musicians and art and other things, it's much, much harder to make that living. But it's the same concept of I tend to think of art as selective recreation of reality based on the artist's metaphysical value judgments. And that's a really esoteric way of saying,
well this is why the authenticity is such a clincher in art, right? It's this idea, what's the worst thing you can be called, at least in the underground music scene that we swim around in? What's the worst possible insult, right? It's selling out. It's doing hack jobs because that's what you think is going to pay the bills. And so there's this almost holy grail of authenticity, which is, I think, doing what Ayn Rand's saying, which is just be aware, be conscious, be intentional, and aim what you're doing at somebody, somewhere, for some purpose that you deem to be noble.
Right. And I think that I can't agree more. That's what we're up against. And the issue is that we disagree on what noble is. But I think that it sometimes...
That's better than just aimlessly wandering through the world.
I mean, not even aimlessly wandering, but I think that there's some people that are not even preoccupied with nobility. The starting point, I think that once you become preoccupied with a noble action, then you have set yourself on the path of being able to ask these questions. And perhaps we will have slightly different degrees of what looks noble. Some people will be more self-sacrificing, some people will be more extractive, but at the end of the day, at least the question is on the table. If you never once
Right.
ask yourself what your obligation to nobility is, then you're not even playing the game.
And that's the more chilling personality
powerful.
that I encounter. I'm not as freaked out by people who are passionate about crazy things, even things that I think might be dangerous. Like, I can deal with that, but when people are just kind of blowing in the wind without having considered the downstream consequences of how they spend their time or whatever, there's something really, that's the ghost in the machine for me, where I'm just like, oh my god, what is that?
Yeah.
It's just kind of eerie. You see,
And it's hard to connect with and interact with, and it's hard to, I don't know, I just can't get through sometimes. That's when I feel like these conversations, I feel like an alien sometimes when I'm dealing with this kind of thing.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree completely that people who have like are not even considering what's noble, they kind of surrender to this like average that they've inherited, right? If you don't even recognize that's a question, you're still practicing something. You just are not conscious of what that is. And so when I think like of art as like recreation of reality based on the metaphysical value judgments of the artist, it's a fancy way of saying you're taking bits and pieces of the world and you're re-putting it back together that reflects what you hold dear, what you mean, right? And this should be like authentic, but it could also be like a jingle from McDonald's, right? Either that's fair, but the same way, like our science is an art in this case, where science is selective recreation of reality to prove something, right? And we kind of want this to be like objective. We want this to communicate between people. So science is also, it's not only an art, but it's also a philosophy or a language, right? A philosophy in how we prove something and a language in how we communicate that thing to another person, right? But at its base essence, it's an art. It's an expression of what we are, right? And so if you're inheriting your art or your science from a drug company or like someone else that's telling you what's important, that you're kind of surrendering what's noble to whatever they're saying it is. But if you go out and say, I love making, absurd science projects or something, at least you are taking that and the power into yourself. And so it's, I think, much easier to have personal growth when you're doing your own hypothesis testing, as opposed to someone else doing hypothesis testing on you. I think this also kind of like integrating in that electric spidery web, right? If you don't know you're being part of it, it's doing the hypothesis testing on you. You're like not doing it on it as much. It's kind of controlling you. And so I think as long as people are like always driving, we're not necessarily making the best decisions, but what this whole journey kind of tells us is that it's like the personal journey that seems to matter to a lot of people, right? And to like really value that. And so in this time of, reimagining things, what kind of a government do you make? One that like it values the personal journey, or one that values like the group journey, right? What are you optimizing for? And I think that is really, really powerful to keep that all in mind of what is ultimately, we're trying to enter this new area where we want everyone's art to be authentic for themselves and to contribute to the whole in an authentic way, because we are all different. We are all individuals. And for some people, this means like group work. And for other people, it means individual stuff, right? Like some people really value being part of a scientific team. And this doesn't mean surrendering your morals. It just means agreeing what the team's about, right, ahead of time, finding your own tribe, these kinds of things. And all these are different ways of saying, of like taking the power into yourself, of not really letting what comes in like dictated and at no point am I telling you to like make the right decision. I'm just telling you to make your decision, right? And I think that this is kind of the point of like anthroposophy, but that there's an important like aspect of humanity that we need to have. And this, I think, is the philosophical concept of charity. And I mean this in like the debate of philosophy, and that if you're interacting with someone who has a different idea, you really want to give them the utmost charity with their ideas, take in the best light possible, right? To have it land nicely, as opposed to like tearing it down, right? And so there's certain things we can do for ourselves to make this world a little bit softer, a little bit nicer. I think it involves a lot of charity, because we don't really know what the right answer is right now, but we know what the wrong answer is. It's like what we're doing right now, right? And so from that, there's infinite directions you can go away from this one point you're at. And I tend to think that this is kind of what's alluding and guiding. And so this is very, very a powerful time, right? In Steiner's like cosmology, it's no wonder why beings would come down right now, right? It's right before that last common ancestor branching out of like a technology-based one, right? There's so many things happening right now where things are really diversifying, right? No wonder we find ourselves here asking these questions, and it's of this time because we really now see and can make sense of these ideas and play them forward and start to like make these decisions and try these things on for size. So of course, entities that are benevolent deities from Venus will come down and offer up like something interesting to you. And of course, technological beings from the future incarnations of humanity will come down and also try and like offer something up. It seems very much of this time now, where all this fits together because it's for up to us to decide how we want to make ourselves in. So the world's going to present you with many, many options of what that could be, right? And it's up to us to like pursue what's interesting. And I think that this makes, make a choice, right? And I think that's so much of what artificial general intelligence is this idea of removing choice, or we're afraid of making the wrong choice. And so we make this thing that will bolster our ability to make the choice that we want to reliably end up where we want to be. And part of the issue is that are we great judges of knowing where we want to be, right? It's kind of like Henry Ford saying, people will tell him to like build a faster horse, but you could build a faster car instead. Right, like are we even seeing the possibilities that we can't see? So as opposed to like dictating where we want to go, also taking to like listening to where we're at and what's happening, right? Things are very different than they have been in the past. They will be very different in the future. And this is very, very unword, very, very hard to like reconcile desire for like Newtonian based outcomes of our experiments with a world of crazy possibilities. And so I don't think there's like any real answer, but there's a few of these notions that I have, like giving charity. And this ties in line with, I've read some of the book, like the Tao of Physics. And it's kind of this older text, the 70s, comparing the findings in the East and these philosophical ideas that different texts pass down, and comparing them to the West. And the thesis of this book is that they both kind of agree on the same thing. It's just that the West is very like noun or outcome oriented, whereas the East is very process oriented, right? So if I wanted to prove to you that like my religion is the best or did something in the West, I would use a series of like facts and figures to try and lead that. Whereas in the East, it would be like a meditation practice or a series of teachings, like what's the sound of one hand clapping, or trying to like induce these kind of like dichotomies or impossible situations. And so this is like a way of being, or rather a process that they're passing down, that if you meditate in this way, you will have these experiences reliably. And again, this is just a different version of hypothesis testing. It's just one that in the West, we don't seem to have much space for. But we are now coming into this thing because, and why I say we don't have much space for it is because the outcomes are different for everyone. Everyone like will meditate, right? But the East really tries to like build these particular experiences that you might have, but everyone will have a different experience. And in the West, I think we kind of want everyone to have a reliably similar experience. And again, like why our school curriculum covers, these general things we highlight as important or omits other things. So I think that with this comes like profound different ways in thinking and passing on knowledge, right? When I was younger, I hated cleaning because I just like wanted things to be clean and not dirty. But now I like it because I'm there like in my body cleaning, right? It's changed to a process as opposed to an outcome. And it's a necessary thing for me to get through the day, because if I didn't make that transformation myself, I wouldn't be nearly as happy or functioning as I am now. So I think in some ways we can like, write off its profundity as like necessity. But at the same time, it just had to happen. And I think that this also ties into like these necessary stages of spiritual growth, right? Like I surrendered to that person as opposed to fought them.
Like there's a Russian saying that's really appropriate here, which is that if you like to go sledding, you should make sure that you really enjoy pulling the sled up the hill as well.
That's excellent.
And it's so true in everything, where this quality of process becomes really important when you think about going to a job every single day. Is the process, let's say you have a set of values, and if we put each value into the spiritual domain, then the value of money and security is one spirit that can possess you. Yeah. The material outcomes is another spirit that can possess you. And then there's the one that's most downtrodden, which is the one of what is a good life and what does it look like to enjoy every single day. And by elevating the process, it forces you to start to ask these questions about the things that you value. And if you value process more than you love outcome, then you can start to ask yourself if the process is worth the outcome.
Yeah.
Is the
I
end
can't
worth
agree
the
more.
means? And so there's all of these phrases, to go back to where we started, the moralistic tone of ancient fables. They were telling you about something. They were telling you about a process, forcing you to think of what leads you to a place and making a decision well ahead of arriving at that place of how you want to get there. And these must be the stories that made us human because they're about choice. I don't think that Aesop came up with them first and foremost. I think that these are things that when we were still animals, we made the choice of what is the process, what do we want it to look like, and we evolve opposable thumbs and hairless bodies as a consequence of the ends and the process that we want to fulfill as we do it, our preferences, our likes. And people talk all the time about how humans aren't evolving anymore. You know, our modern world has stalled our evolution, and I think that couldn't be more wrong because we make these choices daily that are setting in motion things that will take millennia. And so
Right.
just integrate the different impulses.
Absolutely. And I think that this thing about choices is profound and right, because going back to what I was sharing about Steiner's analogy of the horse and buggy, right? Is that if you're just setting the horse and buggy, you're missing the choices that the driver is making, right? And that's really what this like study is about. How and for what reason do you exercise your like godly will on the earth, right? If you can get any outcome, you can create gods. It's like a techno god. AI, you can try your hand at that. It's all within our power to give it a whirl. And I think that I try not to attach like evil to this stuff because I think that
You run the risk of
it's
dehumanization.
yeah, it's choice. Like we can cut this out if it's not to your viewers' taste, but it's fair for me. I spent some time in high school and throughout my life seriously contemplating suicide, right? And I think like many people do in this day and age, like depression being at an all-time high. And so I have this, in a sense, profound experience with something of being very, in a sense, comfortable or thinking a lot about getting rid of part of myself, right? And so whenever people are talking about even the choice to be inhuman, that's what I was up against in a sense, right? And so I have immense respect for people if you're choosing like that kind of self-destruction or self-sacrifice in a way.
I think that a human is different from inhuman, though.
That's a really good distinction. I like that. I wanted to die because I did not like being human. And so I wanted to kind of sense I did not like where I was at. And maybe it is different. It is different. But I think that my goal was like whatever humans were doing at this point in time, sending me to high school, I was not into, right? And I did not want to be part of it. And so I think that a lot of the new age like captures people who are really upset at like where they are, rightfully so, right, in time and space. And it's a desire to not be there. And so you can choose it by like excising that part of yourself, right? But you can also integrate that part of yourself. And
And I
so,
think that the thing that creates the inhumanity is the direction of that force outwards,
yes.
right? I think that I am comfortable saying that there is evil in the world. There are evil
Mhm.
things that people do. And I don't think that it's internal suffering because, I mean, I've gone through periods of like deep darkness of wanting to erase myself from the earth.
Of course.
And so, but the desire was never to also leave a crater that destroys the people around me. I think that ultimately that's the choice. That is where the choice nucleates because I'm like, I don't want to leave a crater. And you start thinking about what it would happen if you were to act on this a-human urge. And you realize
Right.
that in some way it would be very inhuman because what would it do to those around you? And oftentimes I think that is the thing that pulls people out.
I can't agree more. And I think that I've heard that same way of like thinking one out of those holes as by integrating and being part of community and realizing that you don't just get to remove yourself, right? There's always like a void that's filled, and it doesn't fix the problem. That void's still there. And so I think that when, if someone tends to not integrate this very well, they're very capable of doing what we consider evil. But I think that a lot of the point of like the Christ figure and stuff is this forgiveness for these inhuman, or this understanding of this kind of a journey of that, yeah, we're here at this point where your choice is to be human or not human. That's very fundamental to like the questions that we're up against in this bifurcation of humanity that you allude to, right? And so I'm trying to have a lot of charity and space for people who do not like where humanity is at right now and the crazy ideas that come up. From that, it makes lots of sense as opposed to try and excise that part of me and humanity, inviting them in and trying to integrate in the way. And I think that this is through a lot of charity and a lot of understanding. And I think that a lot of times people are afraid of engaging with things like esoteric Christianity or these ideas because it's almost like you become tainted with them. Potentially, right? It can I think we're afraid of the change it could do to us. Or we're afraid of when someone's talking about a subject that's like on the fringe, we're afraid that they're about to jump over the edge, right? You're safe now, but it's really close to going overboard. And so people will attack where they're at now as opposed to because of where they think they could be, right? And
well, that's the idea of the
sense.
info hazard, which I think is a really useful, if overused, sense. I remember we were talking to somebody, an economist, and he said something about knowing facts about the world that he wouldn't share because they were too much of an info hazard. And in that space, I feel like that's not necessarily useful, but the concept of an idea that forever changes you once you are exposed to it is very real.
Absolutely, right. And this is the path of the scientist, right? You can't be the objective observer without being changed by what you see, right? And even down to the physics level, right? Like when you observe a particle, it changes that particle's nature in some sense. Right. And so you
especially when you realize that a particle's definition is a measurement, essentially. So that starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah. And like, how did that particle end up? You put it there. Part of yourself is in that particle that you put there to look at. Right. And so it's hard to remove yourself from this particle and from this like world around you. I think that this is very again, integral to how we put all these ideas together and work with them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, this has been the first edition of Remystify Sci.
Remystify, yeah, I'm sorry.
But yeah, we thank you all for hanging in there. No, I think we've uncovered some interesting ground here. This is obviously an endless topic, and it is sort of the story of our times, and I don't think we'll be putting a bow on it anytime soon. But I appreciate you bringing this Steiner stuff to our attention. I hadn't really dug into it before I met you. And it's a very fascinating poetic lens on what's happening here amongst us monkeys.
Thank you for listening and taking it seriously. I think it's like a very fascinating body of work. And I'm curious if I'm also curious if you have been exposed to it from other people besides me in the past. Has it like shown up before?
Well, I mean, Waldorf has shown up, biodynamic agriculture has shown up, but never linked to the same person and a larger body of work.
I find this fascinating too, because I've always encountered like other people talking, and almost all New Age teachings you can kind of trace back to theosophy or anthroposophy texts, right? And it's just a game of telephone with all these concepts. And so I'm very appreciative of you guys having this conversation with me and kind of sharing these things where I hope on the very least to all these things have like an origin where they come by and it's kind of this natural and ordered, right? Like things make sense upon looking through the history of where it comes about. And I think that was like really soothing to me, right? Stuff doesn't just show up as a crazy thing out of nowhere. And so there is like this deep history through these materials that people can dive into a bit if it interests them.
Yeah, and I love the level of quasi-encyclopedic knowledge that you have about it, where you're not just kind of pointing to abstract notions, but you've studied enough to be able to say, this is what it says, this is what it says happens after, this is how this all relates and maps. And I really enjoy these sorts of conversations where there's a huge wealth of knowledge that can be explored, as opposed to just surface level ideas.
I'm so appreciative. Thanks for digging into that with me. I really like there's always this risk of like profaning the mystery by tying it to modern, findings, right? Trying to integrate the past with the knowledge we have now. But I also think it's why I have the most fun, right? These are two different metaphors. How are they talking about the same thing? And I love playing that. And because even just the information that you guys shared and threw back at me with that is really helpful for digging into this. Yeah. Thanks for making a home for this material.
Yeah, let's do it again. It was really fun.
Absolutely.
All right, Michael. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, good to see you again, man.
You too.
Let's meet up again.
Good to see you guys in chat. Could you guys? I would love to send you just a thank you of a piece of art if you guys would share like some place I could send it to.
Oh wow, yeah.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
That'd be cool.
We have an address that we use for packages, but I think that it might be defunct right now. We have to look into it.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, we'll send you an address. That'd be really
Yeah. Send me an address at some point. Cool.
All right, thank you so much.
Excellent.
All right, thanks, Michael.
Thanks, guys.
See you, man.
Take care.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
You too.